But you're usually at home, right?
Yes, I think we're live now.
Don't let me interrupt Delegate Wilson. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome everyone to the House Economic Matters Committee. Today is Thursday, January 28th, 2001. We have 5 bills before us. In order, they will be House Bill 56, Delegate Boyce, House Bill 64, Delegate Henson, House Bill 350, Delegate Adams, House Bill 37, Delegate Valderrama, and House Bill 124, also Delegate Valderrama.
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
Is there a way right now, it seems maybe, I don't know if it's just my computer, but by sharing the screen, we're not allowed to see the full gallery. It only allows us to see a side gallery. Is there a way that we can set this up to where that screen is just another screen in the gallery? Because right now, by doing the share that we're doing, it forces everybody to have that as their main screen, and we have a very limited view of all the people online.
Yeah.
Yes. Listen, if you drag over to the side, you can make it so that the main screen is kind of smaller, and you can make the participants that are in the Zoom call bigger. So there should be like a little cursor. Let me see if I can figure this out. Denise just showed me earlier.
Don't worry about it. I found it. I'm just gonna, yeah,
okay.
See, I'm gonna drag in. I just want, yeah, I got you. Thank you.
Now, on my screen,
you're welcome.
I'm on that timer. Is that timer going to be that big the whole time, or is that where?
Precisely.
I'm gonna get ready to get the hearing started. I'll take the suggestions later. Okay. All right. House Bill 66, House Bill 56, Delegate Boyce.
Hi, welcome. I'm glad to be here again with you guys. I'll be very brief. This is, for the record, good afternoon, Mr. Chair, Vice Chair, and members of Economic Matters. For the record, I am Regina T. Boyce, here to testify on HB 56, Labor and Employment Leave with Pay, Bereavement Pay, the Family Bereavement Act.
So just put your mouse
authorizes employees to use certain leave with pay for bereavement, defines bereavement and immediate families, and outlines the application used for employees and employer. Bereavement is generally defined as the period of loss after during which grief is experienced and mourned and occurs. Grief is a process an individual goes through after losing a significant person or element from life. Any significant loss can be emotionally difficult and disruptive for an individual, cause complicated grief in some people. A couple of common causes of grief are death of a loved one, suicide, divorce. Divorce represents a complex change that can impact many parts of life and can cause both parties to grieve. Loss of job. Job loss grief reflects the lack of financial security and can affect personal identity. And death of a pet. For some people, the death of a pet can be a significant loss, as the same as human life, especially if it's a companion or a pet for health reasons. Complicated grief is described as grief that is overwhelmingly powerful and without end. This type of grief affects about 10 to 20% of grievers. Grief or grieving has no exact timeline, given that every grief journey is different. The most intense grieving and emotions occur in the first year after loss: birthdays, holidays, anniversaries, and eventually the anniversary of the deceased loved one. 50% of Americans have lost someone close to them over the past 3 years. 50% of grievers feel the pressure to move on. Easy, and especially when there are no supports and time to do so. Grief and unsupported grief have enormous impacts on physical and mental health. There are a variety of psychiatric disorders that can be caused by bereavement. The most common disorders are clinical depression, anxiety states, panic syndromes, and post-traumatic stress disorder. Grief increases inflammation, which compromises the immune system. A compromised immune system leaves the griever vulnerable to infection, increased blood pressure, blood clots, and even heart disease. Research further shows that emotional pain activates the same regions of the brain as physical pain. Physical and mental pain, side effects associated with grief affects a person's well-being, relationships, and work. The Psychiatric Times states that 40% of grievers meet the criteria for major depression 1 month after their loss, and 24% still meet the criteria after 2 months. The reality is that grief costs. The question is whether we want to pay less now or more later. The true cost in grief in the workplace is underestimated. 1.5 million people die in the United States annually, each leaving an average of 5 grieving people behind. The United States loses up to 75 billion annually in workforce, given the lack of support and scheduling flexibility needed for the griever. Grieving employees experience higher levels of daily stress than normal, leading to poor decisions making at work, substance use disorder, and the increased risk of injury. Needs of the griever generally are not addressed at the workplace openly, honestly, and thoroughly. A story in the
All right, I'm joining.
The Chicago Tribune says that we spend upwards of half of our waking hours at work. It is impractical to suggest that people somehow find a way to shelve their emotions up to 8 hours. The consequences of this incorrect data are costing industry many billions of dollars annually. We are challenging companies to open their minds about grieving. If they just have a little more sensitivity, the company gets more productivity. When it comes to giving needed time and flexibility, not many American workplaces are required to offer bereavement leave. Most offer 1 to 3 days or up to a week. How much time you get off depends on where you work, what you do, and how important you are considered to the company. Currently, 2 large organizations, Facebook and MasterCard, have begun offering up to 20 days of bereavement leave in the event of a family member's death. MasterCard is offering 20 days for loss of a spouse, domestic partner, child, or stepchild, 10 days for the loss of a parent, sibling, grandchild, or grandparent or grandchild, including in-laws and step relationships, and 5 days for an extended family member death. And in closing, our experts have suggested that creating and implementing bereavement policies or guidelines that allow an employee to come to terms with a new normal, which allows a griever to begin acceptance of their new normal, regardless of the relationships and grief's need of the individual. The griever are dealing with a huge change in their lives, and that needs to be handled with compassion and tact. The American Psychological Association states that most grievers can recover from loss on their own through the passing of time if the griever has social support and healthy habits. HB 56 will assist in the allowance of needed time to access to support, social support inside and outside of the organization, and the ability to create or maintain healthy habits for creating a new normal without their loved ones. Healthy habits are needed more than ever, especially during a global pandemic where individuals cannot appropriately say goodbye to their loved ones. The bill passed this committee last year 21-2 and passed the House 111-27. It is for this reasons, professional and personal, that I urge a favorable report again of HB 56. Thank you.
Thank you, Delegate Boyce. Any questions? Seeing none. Delegate Wilson.
Like Delegate Wilson.
Mr. Chair. I apologize. I don't know if it's my internet or somebody else's internet. So if I fall out, please forgive me. Delegate Boyce, you mentioned in your opening statements about pets. As I read the bill, the intent is not for pets to be in this bill. Is that correct?
The pets are not in this bill, from what I understood. It was removed. So in my reading, I'm defining grief, and that grief comes in many forms, and that upon research, any loss of a loved one, and sometimes loss includes pets, is just a form of grief. So a pet is not.
I just wanted to clarify that
it is not in the bill, sir.
Right, and for everybody, yeah, that's all. That's one thing I want to
It
clarify.
is in the same posture that it passed committee and the House.
Correct, and we took the pets out of the last one. I just want to clarify.
That's correct, sir. That's correct.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Was there anyone else? Delegate
Turner.
Turner?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted, I might have missed it, but in this bill, how many days did you say, did you say, how many days is it? 3 days, 4 days, 5 days? You didn't put?
No, ma'am. No, ma'am.
days?
It'll
whenever?
be, that'll be based on the employer. So what this bill does is essentially, there is no, in the code, it doesn't allow for, it doesn't have bereavement as an allowable use for leave. So in other words, I will, let's say, I have a family member dies and I need time off. Well, bereavement in the form of like whether I'm using my sick leave or my vacation leave would be allowed to. So it depends on how many days you have to use for that. So this is just essentially, it's like a simple, I guess, overlooked issue is that it's just not, I mean, most employers give it, but it's not even that it's something that you can use leave for.
Oh, okay.
Is that helpful, ma'am? I'm happy.
Yeah, very helpful. Thank you
Okay.
very much.
You're
Mr.
very
Chairman.
welcome.
Mhm.
Was there anyone else for Delegate Boyce? Hearing none. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your time and consideration. Have a good day, guys.
You too. Let me see. Adina Britt. Is Ms. Britt with us? If not, Sarah Price.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Chairman Davis and honorable members of the committee. My name is Sarah Price, and I'm here on behalf of the Maryland Retailers Association. I would like to begin that despite our unfavorable position, we are not opposed to the concept of bereavement leave. We simply feel that the legislation is unnecessary. We do believe that individuals should be allowed time to grieve when necessary, and to that end, all members of the Maryland Retailers Association's Legislative Committee have indicated that they do allow their employees to take bereavement time, and that committee includes both large and small businesses. Employers are not unfeeling to employee needs, and employees can already utilize paid leave like paid time off or personal time without having to provide a reason. And the state has already prohibited employers from asking for documentation for sick time used until after the second consecutive missed shift. As Delegate Boyce clarified, that this bill does not create a new bank of leave and simply codifies what employees are already allowed to do ostensibly. We believe that the legislation is unnecessary. Thank you for your consideration.
Thank you, Ms. Price. I'm curious because that position always sort of perplexes me.
Right.
If it's already what you're doing, then that means it's not a problem. And if it's not a problem, then what's the reason for the opposition?
Wasted time for unnecessary bills.
But we're only here 90 days.
And we're already backed up.
I guess I would take a different position. I think I got a firm handle on what's going on here. But no, we hear that all the time that, oh, we're already doing it, so it's not necessary. And if anything, it just sounds like we're codifying existing practice if we were to take that. So it always baffles me why you would oppose something you're doing. It's like me opposing dinner. I'm already taking it, so why would I oppose it? It just, I can't follow it. I can follow you opposing something you don't want to do.
Mm-hmm.
I can't follow you're opposing something you're already doing.
Partially, it's we don't support one size fits all mandates, or we don't believe that one size fits all mandates exist. It's hard to say that, allowing bereavement leave as codified may work for a large business, but a small business might want to offer support in a different way. So we just believe that it's best to allow businesses to work things out with their employees in a way that works best for everyone involved.
So in other words, not everybody is doing this then.
Not necessarily. I mean, I can't speak for every business in the state. I know that our legislative committee members at least have all stated that regardless of whether they call it bereavement leave, they work with their employees when they need time, and they don't make people come into work when they're unable to do so. Again, I can't speak for every single business. We don't believe in one size fits all mandates.
Thank you very much. Was there anyone else? Delegate Walker.
Just for clarity on this, so if I understand this correctly, an employee can tell his boss, I need some time off for to grieve. He or she does not have to have any documentation over that? Is that what some of the bosses, some of the companies may have a problem with?
I can't speak for every business in the state. I didn't see even in the legislation, though, that it would prohibit a business from asking for proof. I assume that it would work the same, at least under this bill, I assume it would work the same way for sick time, maybe, where they don't ask for documentation. I don't know. I can't speak for every business, I guess.
Do we know, maybe Mr. Chair can help me or counsel, with this bill as it's written, does somebody have to show proof of why they're grieving?
We can look into that. I don't have the answer to it, Delegate Walker, not at the moment.
Okay, thank you.
Generally, I thought bereavement leave related to, and I don't know if it's codified under things we've previously done, but I thought it was related to death and things of that nature, and it was limited to maybe like parents, the immediate family, grandparents, that sort of thing. I've seen it before specifically defined, but I don't know if it does with this particular bill.
See, I remember when Delegate Boyce was testifying, she mentioned, like, I guess for sick leave, I guess after it's the second time, then they can ask you to show some proof or like get a doctor's note to say you're sick. I'm wondering with this bereavement, if I'm an employer and somebody, they've already exhausted all their sick, all their paid time off, they know they've got that, and then they say, oh, can't make it, I gotta bereave over something.
I don't think that this is a separate bank of leave, though. I thought that was noted that it's not I mean, did I hear that wrong? Did I mishear that?
Correct, Mr. Chair, that it's not a different bank of leave. It's the same leave. It just gives an additional reason to use said leave that we passed a few years ago.
Okay, so like I was saying earlier, though, on the sick leave, don't you have to, after the second consecutive time, I thought I heard that from a delegate, I could be off here and still new to the committee, the sick leave, the second time, I thought she said they can ask you to show proof. So
I think that what we did with that, Delegate Walker, it was like the second shift that you miss. In some cases, it's like 3 consecutive days off, but maybe for a restaurant, I think it's like the second shift. They ask you to provide documentation that you were in fact sick.
So with that being said, would you have to, no need to provide documentation that you're grieving? I guess it's kind of hard to prove too, right? I mean, all right, thank you. I got you.
We'll do a deeper dive and get you a correct response for it.
All
right. Is there anyone else? If I'm missing you, please jump in. If not, I believe that's the witness list for House Bill 56. If Delegate Henson is with us, I'd like for her to come forward with House Bill 64.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Are you able to hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, members of the Economic Matters Committee, Chairman Davis, Vice Chair Dumais. Thank you for the opportunity to present House Bill 64, Labor and Employment, Occupational Safety and Health, Hand Washing Facilities on Construction Sites, with the intention of securing a favorable vote. For the record, I am Delegate Shanika Henson, District 30A. Currently, OSHA laws only require hand washing stations for permanent work locations and work sites with harmful chemicals. This leaves out many, if not most, construction sites. Hand washing is fundamental to health and hygiene. Viruses like COVID-19 have only increased the importance and the focus on hand washing. The CDC currently recommends hand washing sites with soap and water for at least 20 seconds to slow the spread of COVID-19, as construction sites have no requirement now for most of their sites because a lot of them are temporary. Employees' hand washing stations are not available to a lot of our construction workers. HB 64 requires the availability of hand washing stations on all construction sites. It can be potable water or it can be fixed. There are several amendments that I would consider friendly to the bill that would make it even better. One would be adding the use of antiseptic hand cleaner sites, because a lot of defining construction site to not include a home improvement site as defined under the business regulation rules 8-101. And another would be putting in assurances against freezing or unusable water. This bill is about keeping our workforce safe, as many other laws are designed to do as well, and keeping our frontline tradesmen and laborers protected from harmful germs, viruses, and bacteria. I thank you all for your consideration of House Bill 64, and I kindly ask for a favorable vote. Thank you.
Delegate Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Delegate, my question is, why was this so narrowly tailored to construction sites? You know, we have, versus restaurants, I guess, Targets, retail stores. Is there a rationale behind why this was so narrowly tailored to just construction sites?
The impetus for the bill on my end was a constituent who came to me as a complaint from a construction site. There were 2 sites in my district that had a stop work order issued because of the spread of COVID-19. And when we were trying to figure out what the cause was, we linked it back to some poor hand washing that was available for the construction workers there. So for me, filing the bill started from a personal story from a constituent. I didn't have constituents that reached out from the restaurant industry or other industries. So I tried to strike it narrow to solve a problem.
Thank you.
Delegate Charkoudian.
Thank you. My question was just answered. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay. Anyone else? Hey guys, to help me see you guys, if you have a question, just raise your hand or hit the chat thing, and I will I'll try and see if I can keep from missing anybody.
Mr. Chair, a question.
Delegate Pippy.
Sure. So this is for the sponsor. I'm reading one of the letters. Looks like from the electrical contractors, I don't know, union, I guess. One of the concerns they have is as it pertains to a construction site where you have a general contractor and then you have obviously subsequent subcontractors that do all the work essentially. So I think they're asking about some ambiguity about who would be responsible for providing the hand washing facility. Would that be the general contractor for everyone, or would it be each subcontractor for their own crew? I don't know, maybe if you could address that.
The bill is written, the bill would be enforced under the existing regulatory framework for Title V for laws that exist there under the labor and occupation laws. So if you have hired the workers and you're responsible to them in all the other ways that you're responsible for them under Title V, then you would be responsible for their hand washing care as well.
So what does that mean?
If under Title V, you're responsible for making sure that they have responsible for making sure that their safety laws are enforced. They have the proper equipment. They have a hard hat. They have, whatever other personal equipment that they need on the job site. Whoever is responsible for that worker would also be responsible for their hand washing, the adequacy of their hand washing station.
Okay.
Delegate Ahrens.
Yeah, just real quick, and this has been a theme the last couple of days on the bills. What's the penalty, and who's the end all penalty on this?
It's enforced under Title V. So there are a range of penalties under Title V, and they vary based on, one, if they're repeat offenses, and then the second factor that fluctuates it is the severity of the offense. So if it results in the death of a worker, then there are criminal and civil penalties. But if it doesn't result in the death of a worker, then there are just civil penalties. But it doesn't go outside of the existing framework. So the civil penalties start with fines, and then they escalate based on if you have repeat offenses.
Okay. You said you made this bill because somebody washed our hands. How do you know that? I mean, I'm confused. Is there something attached to that? Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Thank you. It was a construction site that was in my district, and we had workers there, and the site had a stop work order was issued by our county health department. And after they did the stop work order, through the benefit of contact tracing, I think it gave them a little bit more information than we might otherwise had if it was just a norovirus or some other virus where we aren't employing those type of methods to figure out what the source of an infection is. But we were able to see that construction workers didn't have the ability to wash their hands when they were taking lunch breaks. They also didn't have the ability to stay 6 feet apart or do many of the other things that we say keep everyone safe during COVID-19. But specifically with the hand washing, it was one of those ways that they were able to transmit virus to each other. So based on that information, I thought it prudent to put in a bill that gave them the ability to have that worker protection.
Okay, after we get rid of COVID, let's say this becomes an ideal thing, your intent is to continue this bill because we might get colds or something, or is this just a COVID-19 bill?
No, it's the intention to continue the bill. Hand washing is fundamental to health and hygiene.
Okay, thank you.
Anyone else?
Delegate Watson has a question.
Delegate Watson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Delegate Henson, the committee received an email this morning from a lobbyist who is opposing the bill, and he describes the legislation as being overbroad, vague, and unworkable to implement. And what I'm wondering is if you have been approached or contacted by his client, which is ACE, or him, which is Mr. Bariano.
I did run into him at a restaurant the other day, but I have not been contacted by him about this bill. I would have welcomed the opportunity to work with ACE to figure out how we could have made the bill, in their estimation, more narrow, more defined, and more succinct. I would have welcomed that opportunity. I do think there are a number of very thoughtful amendments that I consider friendly to the bill, and my goal is to make it as workable as possible because I do want it to be successful. But no, I have not been approached about making this bill better by that organization.
Okay, and you probably want to check your email, make sure they didn't copy you on that email, but that would be, I think, a good idea. Thank you.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
Yes, Mr. Chair, Delegate Brooks.
Delegate Brooks, before you get started, I would say anybody to the members as well as anybody in the waiting room, please mute yourself if you're not speaking. We're getting feedback. Go on, Delegate Brooks.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Delegate Henson, did you consider any other cleaning mechanisms such as like hand sanitizer, anything as of that nature to make it more amenable to some of the contractors?
Thank you, Delegate Brooks, for that question. I did, and one of the amendments that I would consider friendly to the bill is the addition of the use of antiseptic hand cleaner.
Okay, thanks very much.
Anyone else? If not, thank you very much,
Sorry,
Delegate Henson.
Mr. Chair,
Delegate
sorry about
Walker.
Yeah, that being said, how are you doing, Delegate Henson? With that being said, with the question that Delegate Brooks just asked, like during this COVID right now, isn't that already state law that you have to have hand sanitizers out and where people are working?
A lot of the requirements for hand sanitizers are the result of executive action, but they're not codified in the law. So once the executive orders expire, that requirement will go by the wayside along with the executive order.
Thank you very much, Hanson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gerald Jackson.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, Vice Chair, and committee members. I want to thank you for this opportunity to testify in support of this very important bill for those of us in the construction industry. Of course, you just named me. My name is Gerald Jackson. I am the Secretary Treasurer for the Maryland State and DC AFL-CIO under the leadership of Donna Edwards. This testimony is more in support of my own local. Plumbers of Steamfitters Local 46 in Baltimore. I am a 40-year member. For 31 years, I was in the field. And for those of us who have worked construction and on construction sites, we know that construction sites are a veritable petri dish for bacteria and infections. That being said, it's very important to find a way to protect our working families from this virus that has claimed the lives of over 400,000 Americans. The CDC guidelines, which Delegate Henson had already alluded to, encourages us to wash our hands under very specific circumstances, which can be from being in a public place, blowing your nose, anything. But those of us who have worked construction know that the use of spotter pots is very unsanitary. Most construction workers do not have a mechanism by which to wash their hands and to prepare for meals or anything else. Construction workers share tools all day, and those things are pendants of spreading this deadly virus. And what we're asking for is for this committee and for the state of Maryland to protect our working families from contracting and spreading this deadly virus to our families. So I'm asking this committee to support HB 64, and I'm asking you for a favorable report for this bill.
Thank you, Mr. Jackson. Any questions? Hearing none. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Champ McCullough. You with us, Champ? All right, let me try Lori Graff.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. I'm Lori Graff. I'm the CEO of Maryland Building Industry Association, and I appreciate the opportunity to testify on this legislation. And I also would like to thank the sponsor for reaching out to us. I've been going back and forth with her aide. We've seen some of the amendments, but not all of them. We do support, obviously, safety in the workplace, specifically through this pandemic. We've been very much on the forefront of safety and making sure our members are safe. And we've done several safety stand downs throughout the pandemic, and I would imagine we will continue to do so. Our concerns about this bill, we do support it with amendments. I do think some of the amendments will take care of our concerns. We have not, again, seen all of the amendments at this point, but there is some ambiguity about the bill, specifically language dealing with adequate numbers. What does that mean exactly? As well as reasonable opportunities to use the facilities. There's just some ambiguity we'd like to work through with the sponsor. Also, we did bring the concern about the hand sanitizers. I think that will be addressed. One other concern we have is what constitutes a construction site. There is a lot of things that happen at different phases. At what point does this have to be implemented? I apologize. And those types of concerns about just the kind of the drafting language, and again, who also is responsible at the end of the day to make sure these hand washing stations or hand sanitizers are there, as well as obviously hand sanitizers needs to be refilled and those types of things. So I'll also say in the very beginning of the pandemic, and this obviously is hopefully something will never happen again, but there was very much a shortage of these types of stations, which was quite problematic in the very beginning. People couldn't get them, but hopefully that has been addressed and will not be a problem moving forward. So with that, I will work with the sponsor of the bill and try to see if we can address these concerns. So thank you.
Any questions for Ms. Graff? Not hearing any. Thank you very much. Let me go to Joe Xavier now.
Good afternoon. This is Joe Xavier. I am a member of Associated Builders and Contractors, specifically the Greater Baltimore location. I'm actually calling from their Construction Education Academy here in the heart of Baltimore City. Overall, we did have a favorable. I know that our legislative group has been meeting with the sponsor, and we are favorable, especially with the amendments. One of the additional things that we were looking at was perhaps adding a paragraph D, which would talk about use of antiseptic hand cleaner if hand washing facilities are not feasible, such as for mobile crews or construction sites when running water or temporary hand washing stations are not readily available. So we do agree that this is a safety concern, and we do agree with the intent of the bill, and we want to make sure that's something that can be implemented on various construction sites and by our members.
Any questions of Mr. Xavier? Hearing none. Thank you very much. Bruce Bariano.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Vice Chairman and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify. I'm appearing on behalf of ACE, which is a organization of union and non-union specialty construction firms in opposition to this bill. As I indicated in an email I sent to every member, the bill is extremely broad and vague, very unenforceable. What does the word adequate mean? What does accessible mean in terms of accessible to all workers? What is clean and sanitary? That can mean a lot of different things to a lot of people. One incident occurred that we know of in Anne Arundel County at one construction site. I'm not condoning it or anything like that, but there's no indication of a broad, wide problem or that at construction sites workers are complaining about inadequate facilities. The bill reminds me respectfully of a bill some of you may recall before this committee to do the same, mandating bathrooms at construction sites. And that bill was not favorably considered by the committee because it's impractical. This bill is extremely impractical. You have construction workers that come on sites at different times of the day. They're not on the construction site the whole day. They're in specialty. They'll come in, they'll do their electricity and then leave. The plumbing will come in and then leave. And then as I think it was Delegate Wilson, perhaps not, but I thought he indicated that why is this just confined to construction workers and construction sites? The bill seems to indicate there's a major problem at construction sites and COVID is rampant there. It's just not the case. I don't think there's anything to support this bill other than one incident in one county with a health department. I would urge an unfavorable report. This bill has civil penalties, it has criminal penalties, and it is so broad and vague, you're not going to be able to enforce it or know what to do and what's right and what's wrong. Be happy to answer any questions. Thank you for the opportunity to speak.
Any questions?
I have a question, Mr. Chairman.
I'm sorry, Mr. Jackson. It can only be from.
I'm sorry. Okay.
Members, any questions? Seeing none. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bernard Brill.
Good afternoon, Chairman Davis, committee. It's good to be here. You have my written testimony, so I'm not going to read that back to you. I just want to maybe highlight a few things that are in there. One, I am the executive director of the Sheet Metal and Air Conditioning Contractors Mid-Atlantic chapter. We have about 60 members employing more than 2,000 workers. I'm also on the board of the Alliance for Construction Excellence, which is a coalition of specialty subcontractors, electricians, plumbers, pipe fitters, painters, iron workers, things like that. As you know, on a construction site, the general contractor, although they have the ability to hire their own carpenters, laborers, and cement finishers, 80 to 90% of that work is conducted by subcontractors. And these people are tradesmen, journeymen, plumbers, electricians, iron workers, HVAC technicians, and so forth. And the majority of these subcontractor companies are considered small business by definition. In our industry, the average company size is 10 employees. So if there are 8 to 10 subcontractors working on a job, does that mean, according to this bill, each contractor has to provide their own hand washing facilities? I'm just concerned about seeing dozens of these hand washing facilities on a construction site. And a problem like weather today, where you have freezing weather, keeping water running through these pipes is a problem. The proposed bill also states that the facilities have to be within a reasonable distance, but I'm not sure what reasonable means or what that, how you quantitate that. Is it in terms of distance, time? This is very unclear to us. On large construction sites, workers are likely to spread out on many different floors or maybe through even over acreage, such as the MGM project down in National Harbor. Another consideration is that it's entirely possible that a worker travel between different jobs on the same day. So does that mean the contractor has to have different hand washing facilities at different sites? This is very complex and gets very expensive. A recent study by SMACNA showed that due to COVID, sheet metal workers lost about 17% of their productivity. Our workers are very keen on safety. They enforce hands, gloves, hard hats, vests, and shoes, things like that to keep workers safe. So this is a very high priority, safety, and we would look forward to seeing this opposed. We speak in opposition of this and would ask for your support. Thank you.
Delegate Watson has a question, Mr. Chairman.
Delegate Watson.
Yes, I had my hand up for the last speaker, but I would direct this question to both Mr. Brill and Mr. Bariano. What I'd like to know is whether or not you believe that hand washing is fundamental to public health.
Oh, it absolutely is fundamental, but it needs to be managed. And this bill is very vague and it doesn't cite whose responsibility it is.
I appreciate that answer. Mr. Bariano? You're on mute, sir.
He may have stepped away.
No, he's on mute.
Mr. Bariano, if you're there, can you unmute yourself?
Click the red microphone, Bruce.
Also, his BlackBerry may not be working well.
Okay, so I'm going to assume he's going to say yes, but I guess the point
I'm
is.
unmuted now. I am
good.
unmuted now. Can you hear me, please?
Yes.
Okay. And the question is the same that was asked before?
Yes.
Well, the answer to the question is respectfully irrelevant to this bill. You tell your children to wash their hands. Washing the hands is of course something we all do, and we're taught
So
that.
no, I would just, if I could just ask,
growing up.
if you don't want to answer the question, that's fine. But
No,
I
it's not that I don't want to answer the question.
I do think the question is relevant to the bill. I think it's incredibly relevant to the bill. If in fact you believe that hand washing is fundamental to public health, if we agree on that, then the question becomes, how do you implement something like this in the situation of which your clients are in? And so that's why I'm asking the question.
But
Because
respectfully,
I would like to see if there is a way to find some common ground, if in fact this is fundamental to public health.
respectfully, you are assuming that people are not currently washing their hands on construction sites, and they're not wearing gloves. So that's why I respectfully don't see the question really relates to the words and language of the bill and its vagueness and potential implementation and the penalties that could be ensuing thereafter.
I'm just trying to determine whether or not we can find some common ground, and apparently we cannot. With
Respectfully, our
your
position.
opinion. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you.
All right, William Yo.
Members of the committee, thank you for giving me the opportunity to testify before you today. As the director for the Maryland chapter of the National Electrical Contractors Association and a member of the Alliance for Construction Excellence, we are in opposition of Bill 64 requiring hand washing facilities. In the construction industry, a general contractor manages a construction project. However, subcontractors are employed by the GC and are responsible for large portions of work performed on the job site. These subcontractors in turn employ craftspeople who perform the work on the job site. Most subcontractors, so you know, privately owned businesses that typically employ fewer than 10 people. With potentially multiple subcontractors on a single job site, my initial question is, would it be required that all subcontractors provide hand washing stations for their specific craftspeople, which apparently it is the case. It just seems like it's an unreasonable request for any subcontractor to do in this situation. How can they provide the required hand washing stations for all their employees? What happens in the construction site that's being worked on? It's spread over a large area or on multiple floors of a building. What do we deem as unreasonable? Would the subcontractor then be required to provide additional hand washing stations if it would be deemed unreasonable because the distance and time or travel? Also, the ambiguity of what is reasonable access. Is that deemed off of distance or time? On a construction site with multiple crafts, it could take a long time for an employee to walk from one end of the site to the next. And who knows how that is determined what is reasonable. Ultimately, we talked about already how there's a 17% drop in productivity, which has directly hurts the profitability of our contractors. Again, as I mentioned, our small business owners that typically employ less than 10 people, adding this additional cost of a hand washing station and the unproductive work time associated with walking to the hand washing station, washing your hands, and walking back to the workstation is just another burden that already hurts our small businesses. Our contractors work tirelessly to provide a safe work environment for all their employees, whether it's supplying PPE, staggering working hours, monitoring the working conditions. However, the proposed bill is an onerous mandate that only impedes productivity and stifles profitability for subcontractors in the construction industry trying to stay afloat during these challenging times. It's for these reasons that Maryland chapter of the National Electrical Contractors Association and the Alliance for Construction Excellence opposes House Bill 64 and asks you to vote in opposition. Thank you for your time and your careful consideration.
Did you say washing hands, that's basically contributing to non-productivity?
It's not that we're not saying that there is not a need for washing hands, so to speak. Everyone wants to be clean, but the question is what the ambiguity of the bill is. It doesn't state what is reasonable. There needs to be more language that specifically addresses this. Also, the fact that we're pushing it onto a subcontractor when it's unreasonable for there to be 12, 13, 14 washing stations for that many tradespeople or different small subcontractors on a particular job site.
Are porta johns unreasonable?
No, it's not reasonable to say that you have to use the restroom.
What if someone's diabetic and they have to use it frequently? Is that unreasonable?
Of course not. That's not what we're trying to. It's not what we're trying to say. It's not unreasonable.
Because that's how it's coming across, that anything that detracts from productivity is a burden on small business.
It's not trying to say
to that sort of thing. You know, as a diabetic myself, you know, I think a quick break to go to the bathroom or to wash my hands. I don't think people are gonna wash their hands all day long. And you know, when we were talking earlier about hand sanitizer, that's a good supplement, but it doesn't replace hand washing. And one of the problems with that is that we have good bacteria and bad bacteria. I think they call it flora that's on your hand. And if you use too hand sanitizer, you can get rid of that good bacteria in the same way that we have good cholesterol, bad cholesterol. There's also good bacteria. So while hand sanitizer has its place, some things you just can't replace in good old hand washing. I guess I would counter, if we really want to hurt productivity, let someone get sick or cold or whatever, and that thing blows through the job site, and then everybody's down, or you know, they're not up to 100%. Well, I don't want to drag this on, but I had just heard that part, and I guess I got stuck on it, that something as, you know, sort of simple but necessary as washing hands was being deemed an impediment to productivity.
But I wanted to address also the fact that it's the cost and the burden associated with the subcontractor to provide it. Now, I agree with you that any person has the right to go to use the restroom, wash their hands, and be safe on a job site. Everybody has that God-given right. But again, I'm only arguing the language of the bill and saying that it is being put down onto subcontractors who are, again, small businesses, trying to make it afloat during these challenging times. I apologize if I offended you or tried to insinuate that someone cannot use the facility to wash their hands or any of that. I just wanted to, like as I mentioned, address the merits of the bill.
Oh, no offense taken. We were just having conversations. Delegate Rogers.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I was just wondering, so have you reached out to Mr. Yull to try to work with the sponsor on what might be considered reasonable? And along those lines, have you given any consideration, and I guess I'm asking it slightly different from what the chairman did, in terms of the lost productivity associated with having a workforce that's taken out because they weren't able to take sanitary steps to kind of keep their hands clean? So that, 2 questions.
I'm guessing that's addressed to me. Again, the only thing that is the bill is just too vague, and the terminology does not assign proper responsibility.
So that goes to the first question. So you answered the second. So my first question goes back to, have you tried to work with the sponsor to come up with some sort of clarity that would work?
I know that the Alliance of Construction Excellence has a lot of bills that we're interested in, and we have Bruce Bariano who works tirelessly to work with
but sir, this isn't a question for Bruce Bariano. This is a question for you, and it was a yes or no.
I work through ACE, and ACE is here because they needed my representation. But me personally, no. The answer is no.
Thank you.
Question, Mr. Chair.
Delegate Pippy. You're on mute, Delegate Pippy.
Sorry. Thank you, Mr. Chair. In a couple of the letters, they mentioned the current OSHA regulations. And so I'm going to look at this from a different angle. And I agree with Delegate Watson that, you know, washing hands is essential. So for a lot of construction projects, you're required to have a hand washing station on site already. And additionally, there's a lavatory requirement on all sites for all jobs. And underneath that, there is a requirement to have access to adequate washing facilities. So for example, if you are a movable unit, where you're not on a job site for any extended period of time, you're required to have some sort of transportation to get to a hand washing facility quickly. And that's written in the OSHA regulations, which I just put in the chat there for everyone. And so my question is not on the merits of the bill, because look, it's important, it's during a pandemic, but is this somewhat duplicative to what is already currently required by OSHA? Is there something that could be modified? So specifically in OSHA, it says very explicitly when it deals with certain paints and chemicals and such, you have to have the hand washing there. I mean, is there something to expand on there versus kind of just rewriting the whole thing? If somebody could just address those questions, that would be helpful. Thank you.
Is this open to witnesses to answer, or is it only?
Mr. Yull, how about Mr. Yull, or the sponsor, either or?
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
May I address Delegate Pippy's question?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Delegate Pippy, thank you for the question. As you mentioned, in the OSHA laws, they require hand washing stations for job sites that have the hazardous chemicals, and then job sites that are permanent in their nature. A lot of construction sites are temporary in nature, so they don't have the requirement for the hand washing stations. I'd also like to address a lot of the conversation surrounding the bill being vague as it's been characterized by several witnesses. I want the committee members to keep the bill in context of the larger regulatory framework. This bill would go in a part of a section that exists already. It would be a part of Title V as an addition to the existing section. So it defines who an employer is. An employer is defined in Section 5 as well. The enforcement mechanism on this would be enforced through Title V as it already exists. So it is one small part of a larger piece of legislation that already exists and is in operation. So to say that if you look at the bill just on its face for the text that's in front of you, you would be missing the full scope and the full picture of our labor safety and regulation laws. So to say the bill in front of you is vague is to throw everything out. When you look through the statute, the term reasonable is used several times, and it's used there to define what happens on a construction site, because we understand there has to be a degree of flexibility to account for the differences and the changes that happen when you're dealing with the work site. Also, I would say that throughout the statute, there are a number of things where employer is used, and the term employer has found its way to determine who has to give people smoking prohibitions and enforce those. The term employer has been determined working in manholes. They figured out that with the term employer. Also, asbestos protective clothing, the term employer is used there. There's nothing dissimilar about this bill than many other provisions that exist in Title V already. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you.
Mr.
Any
Chairman?
further questions?
Yes, Delegate Impalaria.
Delegate Impalaria.
How are you doing?
Well, sir.
Well, one of the ones who I guess are against the bill, I worked in the construction field. And I know in the construction industry, it was required for me to have a hard hat. I provided my own hard hat. That was the rules. I had to have steel-toed boots. I provided my own steel-toed boots. That was part of the rules. Had to have eye protection. I provided my own eye protection. That was part of the rules. And I was the employee. And also, in all those circumstances, we always had hand cleaner on the truck. And we always cleaned our hands because we might be down in the ditch. We might get covered with mud. And then we need to come up. We need to do something else. We need to get the mud off our hands. So it wasn't the contractor's job to make sure that we were doing that. We just did it because that was part of the safety. So I guess if I was capable of buying a hard hat and I'm capable of buying steel tip shoes, I'm capable of buying my own hand sanitizer and my own rags. So to make sure when I'm doing that pipeline and we lay 1 mile one day, that hand sanitizer isn't 1 mile down that I can't get to it, but it's with me the entire time. So some of this is just basic, you need to be personally responsible for your own actions. It's the contractor can't take your shoe off every day to check to see that that's a steel toe shoe. And the contractor can't take your helmet off every single day to make sure that helmet meets OSHA requirements. So I guess the best answer I'm looking for is, isn't that so? And anyone who's against the bill, if they would just like to give me that answer, maybe Mr. Bariano, of isn't that so? My God, that brought silence. Okay. Well, thank you very much. And but that's the way in the world I live in. You have
Isn't that so?
There you go. Thank you. And what would the word be for isn't that so? That special word that you always like to come up with.
Maybe, I don't know where this is heading here.
Mishigash.
There it is. Thank you. Thank you. So,
all right.
Gosh. All right. Have a good one.
Any further questions for Mr. Ewell? If not, I believe Mr. McCullough has joined us. So let me go back to Chan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
I think that this bill really addresses a problem that's already been thoroughly addressed, as one of the other delegates pointed out. Since MOSH has adopted the Code of Federal Regulations provisions on lavatories, that is already existing Maryland law and regulation to which contractors have to conform. And the lavatories, as described in CFR and adopted by MOSH, do all of the things that the sponsor of the bill wants to be done. There's hot, cold, or tepid running water. There's cleansing agents, towels, etc. And these have to be provided, these, as in the lavatory facilities, have to be provided in a quantity adequate to the workers on a site. And as again, I'm sorry, I don't remember which delegate made the comment. The regulations even deal with an area that I have some concern with, and that's mobile crews. You know, a field survey crew, for example. Not realistic, not practical to provide toilet or hand washing facilities on site, but under regulation, as long as appropriate facilities are available within a reasonable distance, meaning someplace you can take your car or truck to, that meets the requirements of the regulation. So I think the sponsor's concern is certainly appropriate and well-founded. However, it's already been addressed, and I see no reason why we should encumber existing law with any additional descriptions that frankly will just give rise to conflict. And so accordingly, I think House Bill 64 should be given an unfavorable report.
Any questions for Mr. McCullough? Seeing none. Let me make sure. Let me check my chat. So, okay, seeing none, hearing none. Thank you very much. I believe that concludes the witness list for people signed up to testify orally. So thank you, Ms. Henson. I'd now like to go to Delegate Adams for House Bill 350. Are you with us, Delegate Adams? Orally? All right, I believe Delegate Adams is in Health and Government Operations. Delegate Valderrama, are you with us?
I'm here.
Let's go to House Bill 37.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, fellow colleagues of the Economic Matters Committee. I'm here before you this afternoon to introduce House Bill 37, which is procurement prevailing wage applicability. The legislation would change the way, would change the way we determine when a public works project is covered by the prevailing wage law. And currently here in Maryland, mandates prevailing wages must be paid on state projects worth over $500,000 and on county, municipal, or agency projects over $500,000, for which 50% of the project is funded by state funds. So if passed, this legislation would eliminate the 50% of state funds requirement, thereby establishing a uniform prevailing wage threshold for all public works projects, regardless of its source of funds. It also reduces Maryland's high threshold from 500,000 to half to 250, which would put us more in sync with our other jurisdictions. I want to make note that school buildings are excluded from this legislation because they are already currently covered by a separate statute. Privately funded projects that aren't part of a public-private partnership are not required to pay prevailing wage, but many do so voluntarily, for your information. Regarding our state's prevailing wage law, it is among the most stringent in the nation. I believe Connecticut has a higher threshold for triggering the implementation of prevailing wages. Threshold amounts vary greatly from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. For example, New Jersey has a 15,400 threshold. California ranges from 1 to 25,000, and 7 states have no threshold whatsoever. Moreover, I want to mention the federal prevailing wage law is only $2,000, which means all those projects being built across the state, for example, from my district in Fort Washington, whether contracted by the federal government or the District of Columbia, are paying federal prevailing wage. So our prevailing wage law, for those who may not know, is formulated annually by the Department of Labor. Each fall, all contracts are sent a survey asking how much a given contractor pays for a particular skilled trade. Prevailing wages often, especially these days for whatever reason, but especially often mistaken for a union wage scale, but it has nothing to do with a union collective bargaining agreement. I just want to emphasize that. Prevailing wage is simply the average pay for all workers, union and non, in a particular job category, in a particular geographic location. So here in Maryland, we calculate our prevailing wage on a county by county basis. I'd like to mention that the pros and cons of expanding the application of the prevailing wage has been debated since prevailing wage laws were first enacted in the late 1890s. Study after study of prevailing wage laws have been written, mostly focusing on how much prevailing wages would add to the overall cost of a construction project. Excuse me. Not surprisingly, there was little consensus among the authors of these studies. But if you perform a simplistic calculation of the wages that you can pay in the marketplace versus the wages required by our prevailing law, you would be right to assume that you could find cheaper workers and that a particular bid would come in at a lower amount, at least in respect to the labor costs. But since labor costs only account for 25% of a total bid, a 10% hike in actual labor costs would only account for 2.5 costs to the overall bid. And though a 2.5% increase in labor costs is not insignificant by any stretch, there are benefits to hiring the better trained and more experienced that prevailing wage workers bring, which is where the other studies come into play. The vast majority of prevailing wage studies over the last 15 years have found that prevailing wage workers are better trained, make fewer costly mistakes, and are more efficient than their less expensive counterparts. These factors will contribute to an overall decrease in the actual costs of the finished project. Moreover, another benefit of higher paying construction jobs is that the state and the localities benefit from higher wage workers, both in the net positive contribution to our tax base and from expendable income stimulating our state and local economies. And a comparison of strong prevailing wage states and weak ones also show a significant decline in the rate of poverty among construction workers, with a concurrent difference in the use of social services and other benefits such as the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, SNAP, and earned income tax credits. Moreover, prevailing wage jobs increase the use of private insurance versus the use of public health insurance or no insurance at all. So all of these metrics illustrate how prevailing wage jobs foster a self-sufficient middle-class income for construction workers. And yet it is the apprenticeship programs I want to mention created by our prevailing wage law that I think creates the greatest benefit for the citizens of our state. So since my first term back in 2007, our legislature has grumbled about the lack of job opportunities for veterans and for our youth who aren't interested in pursuing college, higher education. So expansion of prevailing wage jobs along with the apprenticeship programs required by the prevailing wage law, I think dovetails perfectly with the Kirwan Commission and with the expansion of high school trades programs that at the very least introduce high schoolers to the construction trades. So how much more these high school students will learn by working alongside a trade journeyman during the day and taking classes in their preferred trade during the evening. For our veterans, an improvement in the availability of good paying jobs will help them transition from the military to the civilian workforce. Veterans are already employed in the construction industry at a much higher rate than non-veterans. I'd like to think because, especially due to military offers, the military offers over 20% of skilled trade apprenticeships. Veterans are also valued by contractors for their discipline and seriousness of purpose, which makes them perfect candidates for these essential jobs. So, colleagues, for all these reasons, I believe that this minor change in Maryland's prevailing wage law while keeping a high $250,000 threshold for implementation of prevailing wage will serve our citizens and our economy. So with that said, I would request your consideration of a favorable report. Mr. Chairman, it turns out that my panel, whether they're in the waiting room or not in the waiting room, it looks like finance is also covering the cross-file on this. So I'm not sure if they're here or not to cover Q&A with me or not. But with that said, I urge a favorable report.
The allowance. Are there any quick questions for the sponsor?
Mr. Chair.
Delegate Walker?
Thank you. I'm just kind of, is there a different prevailing wage in Prince George's County than it would be in, let's say, Charles County?
It is based by a county basis.
County by county. So can I write down, what's the prevailing wage in Prince George's, do you know?
I do not, Delegate Walker, but I can get that information for you.
I'd like to compare the two. Thank you.
Sure. I would like, Mr. Chairman, I believe Mr. Mano is in the waiting room. I believe he's on my panel as well, if that was permitted.
We're gonna go to Roger right now.
Oh, okay.
Roger Mano, welcome back, Roger.
Welcome, Roger.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. It's good to be back. Also, thank you, Vice Chair Dumais, honorable members of the Economic Matters Committee. On behalf of UA Steamfitters Local 602, Mechanical Contractors Association of Metro Washington, and the Eastern Atlantic Regional Council of Carpenters, we want to thank Delegate Valderrama and Senator Feldman for introducing this legislation addressing the prevailing wage funding thresholds. In my years working on this issue, I'm not sure if I've seen a time where it's more important to creating and strengthening jobs and programs that leverage the full ability of government to create apprenticeship training programs and pathways to strong community-based careers. The organizations that I represent encompass much of the workforce training, project teams, and contractor ecosystems that utilize prevailing wages to build some of the best infrastructure anywhere. Just some context on the business side. The Mechanical Contractors Association represents 75 mechanical contracting firms, an additional 125 firms who are signatory contractors to UA Steamfitters 602, Plumbers Local 5, and a regional footprint of some $2 billion in annual revenue and some $500 million in state, federal, and local taxes. On the human workforce side, 602 and Local 5 and the Carpenters represent tens of thousands of workers, thousands of local apprentices, and a local career pathway program through Montgomery College, Prince George's County Public Schools, to name just a few. If there was ever a coalition that understands the importance of infrastructure and investments at this time and the dividends that they yield to local communities, it's the coalition that I represent. We've seen how transformational prevailing wages can be in terms of injecting stimulus into our local economies. When properly implemented, prevailing wages help to control construction costs through the use of skilled local workers, increased opportunities for small and medium-sized contractors, and they expand workforce and training opportunities. When thoughtfully designed, it's a great program. However, as we've seen in many other states that utilize prevailing wages, Maryland can further unleash the potential of small and growing contractors and apprenticeship training programs by improving the formulas that trigger onerous funding thresholds. Specifically, Maryland's prevailing wage dollar threshold is the single highest in America. It's a treacherous hill to climb for a small contractor with limited bonding authority, trying to create good jobs and good pathways to those jobs. This committee has the power to make good on a program, make a good program even better at a time when we need infrastructure, skills training, and good paying jobs more than ever. For these reasons, we thank you for your consideration and respectfully ask for a favorable committee report.
Any questions for Mr. Mano? If not, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Carol Colbeth.
I approve of the Senate Bill 30 bonds, so to stay small. So
Mr. Chairman, Carol is my legislative staffer. I think that was
Okay. Then let me go to Jeff Guido.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Can you see me? I just logged into my phone. I was finishing up in finance.
Yes, we can see you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, we support the bill. I represent the 25 local labor unions in the state of Maryland, Baltimore, DC region, but we're private unions and we're dependent upon our contractors to get work. And I got to move away from the other call. Thank you. And so we feel like this gives them an opportunity to bid the work. We have a lot of small shops, 5 to 10 person shops, some 2 to 3 person shops. They pay competitive wages, livable wages, providing health care for our members and their dependents, no pre-existing conditions. We contribute to the apprenticeship training, $22 million a year in Maryland. It also puts money back into the community where it supports the local businesses, local economy, increases your sales tax and your income revenue tax. And we urge the committee for a favorable report. Thank you.
Any questions? Seeing none. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Clayton Sinai.
Clayton is still in the finance meeting, Mr. Chairman.
All right, then we'll move on to Heath Yancey.
Same issue, sir. And so is Lunique Estime. They're all still over in finance. Lunique is testifying.
Leonard Howe.
Written testimony, I believe. They are two minority MBE contractors.
Hold on, it's Leonard
Mr.
Howie
Howie is here, Mr. Chairman. Leonard Howie has joined us.
Mr.
Yes,
Howie.
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, members of the Economic Matters Committee. My name is Leonard Howie, and I serve as the Director of Baltimore County's Department of Economic and Workforce Development and former Secretary of Maryland's Department of Labor Licensing Regulation. And it's a pleasure to see so many of you again. Baltimore County supports House Bill 37, which would lower the threshold for contracts that fall under the prevailing wage law from $500,000, which, as you just heard, is the highest threshold in the country, to $250,000. Last fall, Baltimore County passed bipartisan prevailing wage legislation, joining Baltimore City, Prince George's, Montgomery, Allegheny, and Charles counties as local jurisdictions that see the benefits of prevailing wage policy. Strong prevailing wage policies create jobs, increase productivity, and improves the overall quality of work. And the workers who support our critical public infrastructure projects, which are paid for by taxpayer dollars, really do deserve to earn a fair wage. As Baltimore County works to implement our own policy, we know that passing legislation that supports workers and our local and state economies could not be more critical than during the COVID-19 pandemic. This legislation helps ensure that Maryland contractors are on equal footing, that they grow the local market share for our contractors, and it further supports the pipeline of skilled workers, including those who appear through apprenticeships. HB 37 signifies a further investment in COVID-19 recovery efforts that Maryland has toward its workers and for critical public infrastructure. I urge a favorable report. Thank you.
Any questions? Seeing none, hearing none. Thank you very much. Drew Jabin. Ms. Jabin.
I have a feeling they might be in finance.
Okay. Well, that's it. That's our witness list for House Bill 37. So let's switch over to House Bill 124.
Okay, okay, so I'm going to just finish off before Delegate Adams comes back. Is that how you want to do this?
Yes.
Okay. All righty. Again, colleagues, Delegate Valderrama here now to present House Bill 124 and urging your favorable report on House Bill 24, which would require the Secretary of Labor in conjunction with the Commissioner of Labor and Industry and the Maryland Department of Health to promulgate reasonable emergency regulations to protect our workforce from COVID-19 across our state by March 1st of this year. Among the heroes of the pandemic are the thousands of frontline workers who show up for our work every day so that we can with the Commissioner of Labor and Industry put food on our tables, care for our elderly and disabled, and educate our children. These workers are often exposed to COVID-19 and sometimes have to choose between their personal safety and their paycheck. Although we in our great state do not have statistical data about the spread of COVID-19 in the workplace, empirical evidence shows that the workplace is a significant source of the COVID-19 infection. By simply providing minimum safety standards to employers, we can not only protect employees and their employers from COVID-19, but can also slow community spread. I believe these mandated minimum safety protections will vary industry by industry, but will ensure that workers, one, have adequate employer-provided PPE, two, that they can socially distance, they can work in properly ventilated facilities, have proper sanitation protocols, and have protection from employer retaliation should they file a complaint. A dozen other states have already provided these simple worker protections, including nearby Virginia. Governor Hogan has refused to act through his executive powers, preferring to rely on the Maryland State Department of Health to enforce worker safety related to COVID-19. He also has stated that the health department has the authority to shut down any work site around the state if necessary, and that further regs are unnecessary. I believe relying on the health department for COVID-19 safety enforcement in the workplace is ill-advised for several reasons. One, the Maryland Health Department and our county health departments are already having their hands full implementing the COVID-19 vaccination program, the largest mass vaccination program in our state's history. Also, shutting down workplaces to enforce COVID-19 rules is a blunt instrument. It would be better to adopt clear guidelines for employers, which could be used prior to giving a business an ultimatum, comply or shut down. And MOSH, the Maryland Occupational Health and Safety, already has the expertise and the mandate to protect employees in the workplace. MOSH is uniquely suited to protect employees against COVID-19, but only if they have enforceable standards in place to be effective. Had MOSH had these standards in place earlier this year, we could have prevented innumerable cases of workplace spread and tragedies like the one, unfortunately, this past summer, when 2 poultry workers submitted complaints to MOSH. The press reported these workers were required to work while experiencing symptoms of COVID-19, and were also required to pay for their own PPE, which we all know they already make only but a bit of money in their paychecks. Tragically, 3 workers in this plant died. MOSH subsequently dismissed both complaints by these poultry workers because they contended that they lacked authority to enforce COVID-19 protections like the ones outlined in this bill. As this pandemic progresses, it is becoming easier to become hardened to the deaths of fellow citizens, particularly among workers from Black and Brown communities who have been so gravely impacted. I believe that we must continue to act to protect Maryland citizens in the workplace. I've heard concerns from some advocates who believe that this bill is too rigid and does not allow for changes issued by the CDC on COVID-19 protocols. They are particularly concerned about the back to work provision, which requires an employee to be symptom-free for 3 days instead of the CDC recommendation of 1 day. So while I believe that these advocates are overstating the instability of the CDC's recommendations, I am willing to amend this bill and change the back to work waiting period from 3 to 1 day, and strikes entirely the provision requiring sign off by a physician prior to returning to work. So with everything I've just said, colleagues, I trust you will find that the witnesses on the panel that will be following me, I believe you'd find their testimony very illuminating on this subject. And I hope you will join me in standing up for our great state and for our workers by giving this bill a favorable report. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Delegate Valderrama. Any questions for the sponsor?
Delegate Wilson does.
Delegate Wilson.
Thank you, Delegate Valderrama. Just a few questions. I'm reading the bill. I guess I don't see the 1 day versus 3 days section. I've read it before, but I must have missed that. But I'll get to that later. The first problem I guess I have is, by definition, you want these to be permanent health standards, correct?
Correct. Actually, let me rephrase. So in the beginning of my remarks, I said temporary emergency standards, because right now it is my understanding that the federal government, there will be, and I don't want to misquote what I'm saying, but there are going to be protocols that are going to be implemented. But by that time, we want to have this in place in our state, and quite frankly, I think this would be even more stringent than that.
But the way the law is written, it says permanent, basically moving forward, continuous, not just through this pandemic, or even the bill that you're trying to add us on to that ends 6 months after the declared state of emergency. And in reading about aerosol transmittable diseases, it's not just COVID that we're discussing. It would be basically the flu as well. And my concern really goes down to reading California and several other states. They really focus on just hospitals, nursing facilities, senior facilities, long care, hospices, medical outreach, because they understand that the best way to prevent this aerosol distribution of these type of viruses is through face masks. This does not narrow it down to anything more than every employer, including my law firm. I know the best way to stop aerosols from being spread through these viruses is via face mask. My worry is that the intent of the bill, I'm not sure, but the outcome will be that we have to wear face mask in most in every business forever here forward. Because again, it says permanent, number one. Two, the way to prevent the aerosol distribution is going to be through face masks, which all the places in California that I mentioned require their nurses and their caretakers to wear face masks. I hope it's not your intent that for the rest of time, we all have to wear face masks in all of our businesses.
No, that is not my intent, Delegate Wilson. And in reference to your earlier inquiry, I'm going to point you to page 5, line 23, when you were asking about the language. Yes, and I'll just leave it at that.
Oh yeah, I understand.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I'm just saying the way the bill is drafted, your amendments, your additions are drafted, it makes it permanent, number one. It deals with all aerosol transmutable diseases, which includes the common cold and the flu. And it would therefore, again, require, as they did in California, all of these places, every one of these places, to wear face masks. And I hope that, because I think that would be detrimental. I think everybody's trying to get away from that. And lastly, the cost is roughly $800,000 a year.
So, if I may, know that, and I'll repeat myself, that is not my intent for what you just mentioned, but I will say the impetus for this bill, basically how I mentioned the 3 deaths that were tragically lost from the farm workers. We simply want to have protocols in place so that when employees are in dire straits in their environment, but need to get their paycheck and their bosses are retaliating against them for simple needs, and for them to purchase their own PPE, for an example, I think is just disgusting and outrageous. So I am willing to work on fine language with you and the advocates as well, I'm sure. But to reiterate, that was not the intention with the everlasting. And while you say the aerosols include the cold and flu, I'll admit I'm a germaphobe, so I'm good for that as well. But if that is going to be an issue with regards to passage of this legislation, I'm willing to work with the subcommittee to ensure that everyone is on board with the reason for this bill.
So, and to clarify, to my understanding, then your reason is not moving forward. It is merely to deal with this COVID-19 outbreak, correct?
Well, that is the impetus for this bill, yes.
Right. So it's not to deal with the flu and the common cold, the things that are resurging every year that we have in the fall, correct?
No, it is not. It is not. But given what we are going through, and you know where I'm coming from, Delegate Wilson, that is the reason. And because protocols are not in place, and while the new administration that has come in has said that they're going to start moving in that direction. And I'm being vague, but there are specific details that will follow after my testimony that would probably give you, a better understanding if I didn't do justice. But I feel I did, because I think losing one life is too many. So, 3, and more is just it's not the right way we're going right now. Delegate Wilson.
I totally understand. As the bill is written, it is to deal with all aerosol transmitted diseases, and it is here moving forward. And I want to make sure we can work through those things to get to your point. So because I just don't want this to be an issue.
No, well, if I may, and granted, the last epidemic we had was probably 100 years ago, but to prevent future pandemics, God forbid we have more. That is the whole reason for this legislation.
And that was why I asked these questions, because so it's not just for COVID, it is moving forward into the future. And my worry is the outcome.
Go ahead.
My worry is the outcome. Again, we'll work with it. It just sounds like the outcome is going to be that we all have to wear face masks for the rest of time by the way this is drafted and from what I've seen in other states, which is why they focus solely on healthcare providers.
Oh, okay.
But that's all.
Am I still on? So just to Delegate Wilson, I don't know if this answers specifically like all the inquiries that you just made, but for the permanent standard MOSH, they can apply who it applies to in the standard itself, and it can be different than the temporary standard, which is what this legislation is attempting to do. But I think we know, where I'm coming from, and I know where you're coming from. So I believe we can work this out after this bill hearing. Thank you, Delegate Wilson.
All right. Let me go to Scott Schneider, please.
Wait, Mr. Chair, I had a question. I'm sorry.
Delegate Charkoudian.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Delegate Valderrama, thanks for bringing this forward. Can I just see if I understand it? Because I had a bill last year that was related to heat stress. And it, because we have federal requirements, and then MOSH has the ability to have additional state level requirements, but they didn't have those for heat stress. And so we put into law last year additional heat stress standards. But with the heat stress bill, for example, if it's not 110 odd degrees or whatever the trigger is, then it doesn't apply. But when it is really hot, it does apply. And as I read your bill, it seems to be similar is when there is a significant life-threatening aerosol transmittable disease, then MOSH has the ability to and is required to put these things in place. They didn't do that in the last time, and that's why you're putting this forward. But if there isn't a disease that is life-threatening, so for example, if there's a common cold concern, then these rules about masks and so on wouldn't apply. Is that because I'm trying to understand this too, and I appreciate Delegate Wilson's questions, but that's how I read it, is that it would put MOSH in a place where when there is another pandemic, they have the legal requirement to put things into place, which this pandemic, they said they didn't have the legal requirement to do. Is that right?
Right. So I mentioned in my remarks earlier that with the employees who complained and then they were retaliated against because they say they didn't have standards to abide by, pretty much. If I'm not wording it correctly, I apologize, which is why we're trying to put this emergency, it's labeled temporary emergency standard. So yes, I think is the answer to simplest question. But as I said to Delegate Wilson, those on my panel who will be following me, if I'm not answering it as accurate as possible, I apologize. But the whole impetus was because of this, and God forbid future pandemics. And I am willing to work on, if it needs to be more strict language or more, that's the best. I'm willing to do that to make this legislation enforceable and workable with the committee.
Okay, because I was reading it as right now and then a future pandemic, they'd still have the ability to bring back the emergency, but not
Yes.
that it would be like year round. If there's anything you could catch from a sneeze, then you have to always wear a mask. I was seeing it as something that they could trigger.
And I could see why that language would come across that way. So that is not, well, at least my personal, so yes.
Okay, thank you.
Is there anyone else? If not, tell you what, let me go to Donna Edwards now.
Donna said that she was removed by the host from the
I
meeting.
think she's back in. She just said she's, but she's waiting to be let in now.
Hi, everyone. So we have two. One is owner and one is John Nethercutt. I do not see Donna in the waiting room.
Folks, as you register, sign up, you have to come in on a computer signed up in so we know who we're letting in. Donna Edwards.
She just sent a screen that says, please wait, the meeting host will let you in. I don't know what else to tell.
Give me a second. Tell you what, let's go to Debbie Berkowitz and we'll come back to Donna.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Hi, I'm Debbie Berkowitz. Can everybody hear me? Okay, I'm Debbie Berkowitz, the Worker Safety and Health Program Director at the National Employment Law Project. Prior to joining NALP 5 years ago, I was a senior official at Federal OSHA, and before that, a Union Safety and Health Director for 2 decades. I live in Maryland. In this pandemic, workplace exposures have been a significant driver of the pandemic. A new study just revealed the risks facing our frontline workers. It found that frontline workers' relative risk of death rose 20% during the pandemic, with food and ag workers' risk of death rising 38%. It's clear that protecting workers from COVID-19 at work will mitigate against the spread back of the virus back out into the community. I have no doubt that the high numbers of deaths and infections in this country would have been much lower if the government had implemented clear standards with requirements for employers to implement to mitigate the spread of COVID-19 at work. And now we are seeing a much more contagious strain. Though all workers either on the job now or returning to work in the near future are at risk of illness, Black and Latino workers and other workers of color are more likely to be in frontline jobs, and these communities have a disproportionate rate of serious illness and death related to COVID-19. Because the federal government under the Trump administration had not set any requirements or standards that mandate specific measures to protect workers from COVID, workers' lives and risks have been at risk. Workers in Maryland who face unsafe conditions at work are on their own in this pandemic. This committee knows very well that workers have very limited safety rights. They cannot sue for workers, over worker safety. Maryland must implement an emergency temporary standard and then a permanent standard for infectious diseases that only gets in place when it is triggered by a certain kind of aerosol transmissible diseases and not flu and not the common cold, like in California. Just next door in Virginia, the state agency implemented an emergency temporary standard to mitigate against the spread of COVID-19 at work in late July. And this week, they have made that standard a permanent COVID standard in Virginia for as long as the emergency lasts. But Maryland OSHA has done nothing. And there are many other state OSHA agencies that have implemented COVID-19 related requirements and state agencies that have conducted a great deal of enforcement on COVID violations. And these are good models for Maryland, like Oregon, Washington, Minnesota, Michigan, California. And as spelled out in the legislation before you, the Maryland OSHA emergency standard and the permanent infectious disease standard would require the basic protections that CDC has recommended since almost the beginning of the pandemic. This is not rocket science. We know how to mitigate the spread of COVID-19 at work. Let's be clear, there are no existing standards under Maryland OSHA that contain provisions specifically targeted to COVID-19. None require measures such as physical distancing, the CDC's top recommendation, in addition to masks or notification of exposed workers to reduce transmission. There is the general duty clause of the law, which Maryland OSHA has not used at all, but it comes with a very high burden of proof. And it is not a substitute for a clear standard with specific requirements. The Maryland legislature must pass HB 124. Thank you.
Any questions for Ms. Berkowitz?
I'm also happy to answer questions about the California standard that the delegate had raised if they want.
Don't seem to have any questions for you, Ms. Berkowitz, so thank you very much. I think we have Donna Edwards with us now. If Ms. Edwards, if you can unmute yourself. You with us, Donna?
I am with you. Thank you. I very much appreciate it. Thank you. I thank you, Mr. Chairman, Madam Chairman.
Donna, can you turn your video on for us, please? Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Madam Chair, Vice Chairman. I really appreciate you working with me. This is a brand new laptop and I've got two other ones in front of me, and you would think that I know what I'm doing. I don't. We are very supportive of House Bill 124. We appreciate the sponsor putting this in. We started back in February of 2020 working on COVID temporary standards as well as protections for all Maryland workers. So since the COVID-19 started, you all know in February and March, Maryland workers have been on the front lines combating both the health and the economic impact of this terrible coronavirus. In workplaces all around the state, from grocery stores to social services offices, from transportation to healthcare, workers have borne the brunt of the effects of what is going on with COVID and the minimal procedures and information that's been available at the workplaces. For too many workers, they've had to make a choice between putting themselves at risk or keeping a paycheck. And they've performed their work duties very, very professionally. In May of 2020, the Maryland State and DC AFL-CIO sent a letter. Was signed by over 60 of our national and statewide local leaders that live in Maryland. We sent it to the governor, employing him to implement the emergency temporary standards through executive action, compel MOSH to proclamate regulations to provide safe working conditions. The letter you have is attached to this testimony, so please avail yourselves of it. It was supporting and echoing our request. After that, dozens of doctors and health officials from around the state, including Johns Hopkins, University of Maryland, several of department heads and counties, signed a letter supporting that, sending it to the governor. And then following that, multiple advocacy groups submitted their own. So we are really calling upon you all as the legislators, as our lawmakers, to really provide this relief and create an emergency temporary standard. But what's good also about this bill is that House Bill 124 also provides for a permanent occupational safety and health standard to protect workers from such diseases. Let's be honest, COVID-19 caught us flat-footed. We were unprepared. And so we are asking that you take the necessary steps to protect Maryland workers and to stand up for the dignity of our work, not just give us accolades and call us heroes, but through this bill, give us real protections and the respect that we've earned. Thank you. We ask for a favorable report.
Thank you, Donna. Any questions for Donna Edwards? Seeing none, hearing none. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
David Rodwin.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chairman Davis, Madam Vice Chair, members of the committee. My name is David Rodwin. I'm an attorney at the Public Justice Center. We are a not-for-profit civil rights and anti-poverty legal services organization in Maryland. I work in the PJC's Workplace Justice Project, where I represent low-wage workers. I've represented workers in connection with complaints to MOSH on both COVID-related issues and issues unrelated to COVID. I won't mince words here. The situation in Maryland has been a disaster for workers. We need HB 124 to require MOSH to take action on COVID-19 and any future respiratory disease pandemic that catches us, as Ms. Edwards says, flat-footed. Because the past year has shown that without a requirement, MOSH cannot be relied upon to protect workers. Workers across the state have filed complaints with MOSH about workplace conditions that contribute to the spread of COVID-19. These include a lack of social distancing, lack of enforcement of mask rules, little or no ventilation, and the employer's failure even to tell workers when they've been exposed to a coworker who has tested positive. But after workers have filed these complaints with MOSH, MOSH has been telling workers and their representatives that they, quote, don't have jurisdiction over COVID-19 complaints, which they've said are a job for county health departments. County health departments do not have the resources or the experience to conduct the kind of investigations that MOSH is uniquely trained and situated to perform. And just as a note of experience here, we did also submit a complaint to a county health department, which rather than conducting an on-site inspection, as really should have been done here, called up the employer who led the county health inspector on a FaceTime iPhone tour of the workplace, showing them only the things that the employer wanted them to show. Meanwhile, at this workplace, infections continued to skyrocket and spread throughout the workplace over the following months. It's not true that MOSH doesn't have jurisdiction over COVID-19 complaints. It does, as part of the general duty clause that Ms. Berkowitz mentioned, though that clause is insufficient in that it doesn't provide the specifics and the enforceability that this bill would provide. And the fact that county health departments have some limited authority to also enforce some limited COVID-19 guidelines doesn't take any power away from MOSH. And in fact, MOSH's failure to protect workers from COVID-19 throughout this pandemic is the subject of a federal complaint that the Public Justice Center filed with federal OSHA, which federal OSHA is now investigating. But the lesson here is this: unless the General Assembly requires MOSH to act, both with respect to this ongoing pandemic and to protect workers in any future pandemic that may arise, when their employers don't take necessary steps to prevent the workplace spread of COVID-19 or a future respiratory disease, MOSH has shown that it can't be counted on to do so without such a requirement. And the consequences of that failure, as devastating as they've been over the past year, could be even worse and even deadlier next time. So for these reasons, the PJC requests a favorable report on HB 124. Thanks very much.
Any questions for Mr. Rodwin? Hearing none. Thank you very much. And let me go back. I called Mr. Scott Snyder earlier, and then I went to the sponsors panel. So Mr. Snyder, are you with us?
Yes, I'm here.
Right. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon. My name is, and thank you very much, Chairman Davis and Vice Chair Dumais. My name is Scott Schneider. I'm a certified industrial hygienist and a fellow member of the American Industrial Hygiene Association. I've been working as an industrial hygienist for over 40 years, and most of my career has been focused on construction safety and health. I retired a few years ago from the Laborers Health and Safety Fund of North America, where I was Director of Occupational Safety and Health for over 17 years. I've been a Maryland resident for over 36 years, living in District 20, and I'm testifying today on behalf of over 24 health and safety professionals living in Maryland, many of whom have been active for decades, and the National Council for Occupational Safety and Health. We've submitted a statement as written testimony, which I'm not going to read, but I wanted to thank Delegate Valderrama for introducing this important bill. We also sent a petition to the governor almost 7 months ago to issue an emergency temporary standard to protect Maryland workers from COVID. By ignoring our petition and those of many other groups and refusing to actively enforce COVID protections in essential workplaces across the state, the governor has allowed many essential workers to be exposed to the virus, contract the disease, and die. These deaths were preventable. Our only recourse now is for the legislature to force the governor to mandate these protections. We hope you will support this bill and finally provide Maryland workers with the protections they deserve. They should never have to choose between their job and their health. So we encourage you a favorable report on this bill. And thank you very much for your time and your attention.
Any questions for Mr. Snyder? Delegate Howard?
My question was for David Rodwin, really. If I could just go back to that, if that's okay with you, Mr. Chair.
Sure.
So you said enforcement action, David. One of the things you talked about was enforcement action. What is that? Lawsuits?
I am not sure that I used that term enforcement
You
action.
did.
I may
We
have.
can go back to the Wayback Machine here on the computer and for you. You did. And I think what you meant was lawsuits. And the next question is that you said that your organization has a complaint in against Marilyn Mosch. What's the nature of that complaint?
So we just with respect to workers can't file lawsuits with respect to these sorts of motions.
So you're here testifying on behalf of this bill so you could file them for them. What's the nature of your complaint with Mosch? What's the nature of your complaint with the Mosch organization and yours?
Well, the Mosch complaints are administrative complaints. They're not court suits, but the complaint that we filed with federal OSHA.
Your federal complaint.
That was asserting that Mosch had. So Mosch, as a state plan, is required to provide protection at least as strong as the standards set out under the federal OSHA law. And the complaint was based on the fact that Mosch was sending all of these telling workers that Mosch could not do any investigation related to COVID-19 and sending them to county health departments. So it alleged
complaint
that
was based on, so there is no longer a complaint?
No, I'm referring to when we filed it a few months ago. The investigation is on
by the federal courts in the investigation on that.
So it's not a complaint in federal court. It's a complaint filed with federal OSHA. So it's not a lawsuit. It's an administrative process that federal OSHA is now undertaking an investigation of.
Okay. So you realize this pandemic is completely unprecedented, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If there are no additional questions.
Mr. Chairman, I got a question.
Delegate Mout.
Well, thank you. And this is for any of the witnesses, but COVID enforcement is an interesting thing. I mean, you know, social distancing and the rules are more of a concept than a hard line. And there depends on exactly which one you're talking about. Of course, you know, it can be, but would you support any sorts of rules for Mosch inspectors and how they enforce these rules? Or do you think there's any need for that? Any of the witnesses?
I'm still here if you.
You want to take that, Donna?
I guess I will. I think that we do need to have enforcement. I know that this is like Delegate Howard said, this is unprecedented, that's for sure. But I'm also taken by the fact that there is another bill to provide immunity to all businesses on any COVID-related claim. And I find it interesting that if workers haven't been able to even be given protocols or written instructions in all of the work sites on these are the things that should be followed, wearing your mask all the time, washing your hands, having, the 6 feet, or if you're not there, what do you do in the back of a restaurant? What do you do from office to office when your temperatures may be taken, your temperature may not be taken, or they say, well, go in the back door and you won't have to do this. There's a lot going on out there. So we can't have it both ways. We can't say, well, we want total immunity when there are actually no written MOSH requirements that require everyone to have, this is your minimum procedures and information.
That's a bill that
that's
hasn't
what
even
this
been
is getting
heard.
at.
That's a bill that it hasn't even been heard.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, but
I'm just saying that all I'm trying to say is that at a minimum, we should have at each work site, these are like we do on any safety hazard. We have them for chemicals. We have all kinds of standards in MOSH for many things that go on in various work sites.
So I think
so that's all we're saying is like, let's have MOSH proclamate occupational safety and health standards for these types of diseases.
And your answer to my question is no, I think. And I get it. I mean, absolutely, we need to protect everybody we can, any way we can. But I've seen this switch of power, and all these emergency rules have, where there's this constant balance, and the balance has been thrown way out of whack. And I didn't know from your constituency if you had experienced this, but you're giving a couple individuals a whole lot of power, and without any checks, and they're presumed correct. They're already presumed to be because of the work they're doing. They're presumed to be, working in everyone's best interest. But in reality, on the job site, things can be a little bit different. Now, that's not saying there are times when, you need somebody to come in and enforce the rules for safety. But there's other times when there's people doing their job that they get a lot of authority, and they want to use that authority because that's why it was given it to them, and that's what they're getting paid to do. So they want to go out and they want to assert those rules, and that's going to affect the employees and the employers. And I'm very familiar with that experience, and I just thought maybe you may want to consider that when you're proposing these things. But your answer was no, and I appreciate that. So thank you.
Delegate Arendt.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess to Ms. Edwards, if you don't mind, what we're doing right now, we are looking at a tremendous amount of legislation based on an anomaly, something we've never seen. And I think we're going down a slippery slope here, because if we start to compare numbers with previous years of just flu deaths and what have you, we're now entering into something. Is the intent of something like this to maybe next year keep all these things in effect because people are dying from flus, people are dying from cancer, people are dying from this? This bill is, because where we're at right now, we've never seen this yet. We're coming down, and the federal government is trying its best to alleviate some of these problems, even in the circumstance of death and what have you. But this bill is setting a precedent I just think is very dangerous for not only regular business, but unions such as yours. I mean, to me, I don't think we're wise to do this in such a quick way, even based on the fact that the transmission, I mean, the ability for people to view these bills. I mean, I just think this is setting it up for something worse down the road. Would you agree?
I would not agree.
Thank
These
you.
were not taken very quickly. we've been working on these, and what was put out. as far
Excuse
as
me,
what we-
with all due respect, ma'am, we've had this pandemic for a little less than a year. We've
Yes.
had the flu. We've had everything else for hundreds and thousands of years. So I appreciate that you don't think it's going down that slope. Thank you very
Okay.
much for yours.
Thank you.
Delegate Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciated that sigh before you called my name. I'll try to be brief.
Yeah, I'm sure you will.
Donna, first of all, I want to say I really do appreciate the juxtaposition you put between this bill, people who oppose this bill that still want immunity for any and everything. So I'm really for neither. And I'll say this because my issue with this bill is the tension. If you heard me ask Delegate Valderrama, I'm going to repeat some of this to you. The tension between COVID and the flu or any other aerosol related disease. And one of the things that you mentioned, which caught my ear, was you weren't just talking about, you don't want this just to apply to COVID, but future looking diseases like the flu. And I use that as an example because that's the only one I know besides COVID. But it's not narrowly tailored to COVID. It is permanent and it's for all employers. And as I said earlier, the other states that have a bill, some of these issues, they really did focus on health care because that's where individuals could have the transmission. And that's also where it's viable to wear a mask all the time. Would you be willing to narrow this to dealing with this specific pandemic? And if not, how do we ensure that we're not basically, as I've asked before, required in my law office, in any construction site, at a Safeway, at a Target, to wear face masks and face shields in perpetuity? Because the way this bill is written, that's going to be the outcome. Do I have to repeat it? Did you hear me?
No, I didn't. I was
Okay.
kind of waiting for the sponsor. I don't want to overjump the sponsor.
I'm sorry, Donna. I'd already asked the sponsor and I didn't want to catch her off guard. And I know we've discussed many times. I was asking what your view of this bill is in line of my question.
I would say if we can get an emergency temporary standard for COVID, we should do that.
Got you. And see, that makes it a lot easier for us to digest. Thank you very much.
Delegate Charkoudian.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I actually have a follow-up question to Mr. Rodwin, if that's okay. Because it gets to this technical issue of I want to make sure I'm understanding this bill right. The way that I read the bill is in COVID, here's the standard, MOSH can enforce it. And if there is another deadly pandemic in this country like COVID, then the standard would come into place and MOSH can enforce it. But in between this pandemic and God forbid the next one, things like the common cold and the flu would not trigger these same protections. Am I understanding this right?
That's precisely my reading of the bill, Delegate. Because although this, the pandemic may have been unprecedented in the sense that nothing like this has happened during our lifetimes, but it wasn't unpredicted. And these sorts of things, unfortunately, are predicted by the folks who study these issues as becoming more and more common as viruses that are spread typically through animals start to come more into human populations due to loss of habitat. So exactly right. If and when there's another pandemic that begins, that would sort of trigger the permanent standard that would exist in this bill that would allow MOSH to just sort of immediately sort of make it take effect and give employers information about what the requirements would be so that we're not again starting from square one like we did here where we lost 10 months and however many thousands of Marylanders who passed away.
Thank you for that. I also, as you know, had multiple conversations, reached out to MOSH myself because I was concerned about the fact that they weren't implementing any sort of emergency standards. So I'm inclined to support this and to support the ability to implement it quickly should, again, God forbid, we see this again. I do share, of course, Delegate Wilson's concern that we wouldn't want to require masks permanently because the common cold still exists. And so I guess I just wonder if, maybe it's a review of the bill or analysis or something where we can clarify that, because I think it's crucial that we have the ability to trigger it again at some point in the future. But I do see that as very different than understanding this to be a permanent standard for the common cold. So thank you for that clarification.
Delegate Watson.
I would just say that to Mr. Where'd he go? Edward Rodwin. If there was a way that we can thread the needle so that it just as Delegate Charkoudian just said, it's available if we need it. Because when I think about what several of the delegates just said about, this is unprecedented, and it's true. But, we had a 1 in 1,000 year flood in Ellicott City in 2016, and everybody said, it's never going to happen again. It happened again 2 years later. A lot of that has to do with climate change. And so, which is part of what we're seeing in terms of these pathogens. So I would just say, if we could find a way that made it apply just to this particular situation, but it could be resurrected should it need to be down the road, I think we would have a jump on it when we didn't this time around. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Madam Vice Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I am probably missing something based on some of the questions. However, if you look at the bold language, and I guess this question is probably more to the sponsor or to Mr. Rodwin. If you look at the bold language on page 1 of the fiscal note, and if you actually read section 4 on page 6, lines 15 through 23, is it correct? My understanding is that this does in fact terminate 6 months after the governor's existing emergency order goes into effect. Is that your understanding as well, either Delegate Valderrama or Mr. Rodwin? I mean, I think it does end. I think it's designed to end, and I think the fiscal note makes that clear.
That is sorry, I was trying to find the screen again. That is emphasis, but I mean, that's the way I read it, understood it. But I mean, if there's other, apparently people are having different variations, which is, interpretations, which is not surprising. But
it's your intent that it actually ends 6 months, that with reference to these temporary emergency
it ends in
standards,
6 months. Yeah,
they end 6 months after the emergency.
Yes, Madam Vice Chair. Yes.
Executive order by the governor ends.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other member have a question? Oh, Delegate Wilson. By the way, I sent Chairman Clippinger a call. He's expecting your call.
And again, I because I'm hearing two specific things here. I'm hearing that we want this to be ready for the next one. And we also, because I've read, as the Vice Chair read, the end of the bill, which is why the word permanent kept sticking into my mind, because the beginning of the bold language says permanent, meaning 6 months it's not going to end. And I tried to juxtapose those two understandings, which is why I listened to testimony and heard repeatedly for the next time, for the other issues, which in my mind meant it wasn't the intent to end 6 months after this state of emergency was declared. And I found no language of, as good Delegate Charkoudian said, of that this would kick in case of another emergency, because by our Vice Chair's reading, it never kicks in again 6 months after this emergency is declared. I don't believe that that was the intent for 6 months, because otherwise it wouldn't kick back in. And this is not an argumentative question. Please, is the goal to have something permanent? Is to have something waiting? What is the goal? So we know what we're doing. Anybody can answer. Do we want to have something for
Delegate Wilson, there are other advocates and panelists who were not finished with the witnesses. So
anybody can answer the question.
I haven't gone yet, but I can take a second.
Hold on, guys. Delegates, I need you all to help me. I need you all to ask someone specific the question, and then that person responds. We aren't going to just throw one out there anymore and let
Hey,
everybody take a shot.
I'll put that to Mr. Rodwin. That was my original person. I just didn't want to corner anybody. Mr. Rodwin spoke from the legal side.
Sure, thank you. I'll defer later on to Ms. Waterman if she has anything to add. My understanding is that the bill has sort of two components to it. There's the emergency temporary standard that sort of sunsets, and then a permanent standard that could be triggered later on when the next one hits, if and when the next one hits. And those are sort of two, branches to the same bill, both of which are designed to get at this problem of not having adequately specific standards that MOSH can apply when there's a pandemic that arises. So I guess there's sort of both in the same bill.
But it's almost like a legal fiction to say permanent, but kicks in at another date, because either it is or it isn't if it's permanent. So I'm really not sure legally how you mean that. But you know what? I think I got enough to understand the intent. We'll work with it. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think I could answer the question very quickly.
It's got to go to who the delegate addresses. It's not a group discussion here. Any other questions from delegates? If not, let me go to, I think it's pronounced Jonah John Baptiste.
Yes.
The floor is yours.
Yeah, my name is Jonah Jean-Baptiste. I lost my husband from COVID-19. He was working at the chicken plant. My concern is this. I asked if they can pass the bill because there's no safety there for real. Because if you positive, nobody tell. Around this time, my husband was work there. So the other people, they still tell me, the worker, they still said there's no safety there for them. So even though one of them got it positive, they never tell them. Even the health department called me. They said there was other people before my husband, and they don't tell them. So they still have a secret inside. So they want you to work. So even though it's going on inside the plant, they still don't let you know. So now you don't know. You just go work and then you bring it home. That's how my grandma catch it from my husband. So I had two people pass away in April. My grandma 86, my husband was 44. This bill need to be passed because the safety is supposed to be a safety in the plant for the worker. That's all I can say.
Thank you, Ms. Jean-Baptiste. Let me go to Donna Zankowski.
Yes, can you hear me okay?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. So thank you for allowing me to speak with you today. It's definitely an honor and a privilege. My name is Donna Zankowski. I've been a registered nurse for 36 years. I've worked in the hospital setting for 7 years before that. I spent the greater part of my life as a nurse, and I'm here to speak to you today as a nurse and a member of the Maryland Nurses Association. COVID-19 is not like any experience I've ever had in healthcare. I've lived and worked in California back in the 80s and 90s during the height of the AIDS crisis. And as terrible as that was, I never felt that being a nurse put my life on the line. I had faith in the information I received from the CDC and other government leaders, and I had faith that my employer would provide me the protective equipment that I needed to stay safe. This is different. As of January 6th, Kaiser Health News announced that at least 3,248 US healthcare workers have died from COVID-19. Nurses were the largest percentage of the dead, about 1 in 3. This report did not surprise me. Since the beginning of this pandemic, I have been following the stories of my fellow healthcare workers closely, with them buying their own face masks, working 7 days a week, how they hold the hands of patients whose families are not allowed to be at the bedside so they wouldn't have to die alone, and how many of these nurses eventually became ill themselves. The American Nurses Association surveyed more than 21,000 nurses in July and August of 2020, over 6 months into the pandemic. And they found that 16% still reported a widespread shortage of protective equipment like N95 masks, which prevent aerosol transmission, and gloves and gowns, etc. 53% said the situation was as bad or actually worse than it was earlier in the spring. 68% were required to reuse their single-use N95 mask. And not surprisingly, a majority of the nurses felt their workplace was unsafe. Many studies have shown that healthcare workers, especially nurses, have an infection rate 7 to 10 times higher than the general population. This strain on our healthcare system has led to poor staffing, a crisis in patient care, exhaustion, trauma, and moral distress among healthcare workers to a level I have never seen before. We cannot continue to serve you unless you do something right now to protect healthcare workers and all essential workers from COVID-19. I'm asking that you favorably consider House Bill 124. We need the full attention of this body, support of the Maryland Department of Labor and the Maryland Department of Health to use its full authority to do what we have so far been unable to do, which is to protect workers from COVID-19. Let us continue to help you. Please help us. Thank you so much.
Right. Any questions for Ms. Zenkowski?
Aaron's.
Delegate Aaron's.
Thank you. Ms. Zankowski, just real quickly, and thank you for your testimony. I appreciate all the work nurses do. In my county in particular, last week I was called and we were talking about the vaccines, and I was told that upwards of 25 to 30% of my first responders are not taking the vaccine. Can you help me with why that might be based on the need?
I understand. Yeah, it is a little different than this topic, but actually hesitancy in accepting the vaccine is a very big problem among healthcare workers. There's a little bit of differentiation depending upon the education level of the healthcare worker, because, you know, we have folks that work, you know, they're doctors and PAs, nurse practitioners, into, you know, the folks in the lab and the kitchen. But, you know, part of the reason that we found that there's been a lot of hesitancy is because the way the vaccine was created so quickly. Normally, you know, the process takes much longer. So there was a little bit of distrust in some of the science. And also, when you look at who is being vaccinated, there's been distrust among some of minority population healthcare workers who have some traditional distrust in vaccine process because of past history of some very bad things happening with the minority populations and vaccinations, and feeling like they might have been experimented on. So we have a lot of work to do. I know big groups like American Nurses Association are working on that hesitancy, trying to get the message out, you know, please get vaccinated. And I think that, you know, we're doing the best we can, but yeah, we absolutely have to fix that. Thank you.
I guess part of my comment is that the CDC and everybody are coming out saying you need to take this, you need to take this. And, you know, we're saying we're not doing enough, yet they're telling us we should take it, yet we're getting people saying, I refuse, I don't want to because. And I guess it sends a mixed signal, but that's my comment. It seems strange to me that we're taking parts of this and we're not going after others, but thank you.
Is there anybody else? Anybody else for a question for Ms. Zenkowski? If not, thank you very much. Champ McCullough.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, thank you very much. We, on the whole, think that House Bill 124 is both well-intentioned and reasonable, but we do have some specific issues with language in parts of the bill. And specifically, if you look at page 3 in line 17 regarding cotton face masks, we think that the Virginia Occupational Safety and Health Administration has a better formulation, which is a face covering, surgical mask, or respirator, whichever is best suited for the risk level. Cotton masks aren't sufficient or appropriate in all construction situations. And so we think revised language would be helpful. With respect to one other, if you take a look at line 17 on page 3, we've had the discussion with respect to HB 64 on what kind of hand washing and sanitary facilities are appropriate. And as the fiscal note on that bill pointed out, the federal regs, which have been adopted by MOSH, would speak to an appropriate level of sanitation. And so we would encourage the bill to be amended to reflect that. Let me skip over one and I'll come back to it. On page 5 in lines 12 to 14, it says that reporting has to occur if there are 3 incidents in a 14-day period. Our safety professionals think that is probably not stringent enough and would encourage that to be changed to a 5 to 7 day period. The notion is also that if you have an incident on day 1 and then you don't have any other incidents until 2 more on day 14, that really doesn't indicate that you've got a COVID issue or problem at the work site. And a shorter time frame would capture that more accurately. The last item is in my written testimony, but on page 4 in line 14, it encourages and protects employees who go to the media or social networks. Now, particularly with respect to social networks, those are hardly the most reliable vehicle for disseminating information. And we think it's inappropriate for the state to direct employees to go to other than state or appropriate agencies of government to report whatever concerns they may have. And with those changes, Mr. Chairman, we would give the bill a favorable report.
Any questions for Mr. McCullough? Delegate Wilson, is your hand up or did you forget to take it down?
I thought that was a permanent feature, Mr. Chair.
It just appears that way. Delegate Ahrens. You're muted, Delegate Ahrens. You're muted, sir.
Oh boy. Oh boy.
I couldn't hit the space bar. I'm sorry, I had it up. I was trying to be like my good friend, the delegate. I'm leaving it up. Sorry.
Thank you, sir. Not seeing anyone else. Let me go on to the next witness, Ms. Chloe Waterman.
Hi, Chairman Davis, Vice Chair Dumais, and members of the committee. Thank you so much for the opportunity to testify today in support of House Bill 124. I work for Friends of the Earth and am here today representing a coalition called Marylanders for Food and Farm Worker Protection that mobilized over the summer in response to the conditions that food and farm workers in particular were facing in Maryland, as these workers are often neglected from the state's labor laws and other protections. This bill applies to them as well as all of the other workers that MOSH currently covers. I just want to use my time to try to clarify Delegate Wilson's question around the purpose of this bill and the distinction between the emergency section and the other section. So I think of it, as Mr. Rodwin said, in 2 components. One component is an emergency temporary standard that kicks in basically as soon as possible, as soon as the bill passes, and that expires after 6 months. And that's actually not tied to the governor's emergency order. It just goes away after 6 months. And then we're saying that we also want MOSH, while that temporary standard is in place, to develop a standard that I think is better thought of as a contingency standard than a permanent standard. And that seems like maybe the root of your confusion. And I think that there's some language things that you've pointed out, Delegate Wilson, that we could definitely clear up to make it clear that this would be something that MOSH can establish. They can have this section of the bill leaves a ton of authority to MOSH, a ton of discretion to figure out which aerosol transmissible diseases do we want to cover? Does it make sense to cover just influenza? And actually, maybe they say, yes, it does, but the standards for influenza are just more stringent hand washing every 4 hours instead of once a day. That's just a made up example, but these are the kind of details we want MOSH to get into and think, how can we be prepared both for the aerosol transmissible diseases that we are dealing with, like influenza that does kill 60,000 people a year, but also so that if and when the next pandemic hits, we have some standards in place that can be altered a little and that can kick in so that right at the beginning, when this is spreading like wildfire, we immediately have something that's applying to workplaces. The second point that I wanted to make, and I hope that clarifies it. And the second point that I wanted to make in my testimony is just to respond to the fiscal note of the bill. It's really hard to understand how the fiscal note of this bill can be so high when it's modeled really closely after Virginia's law, which had a fiscal note of $0. MOSH has employees that can be directed to do these inspections. They can be redirected from what are currently higher priority areas to do these COVID-related inspections. For example, right now they're doing a lot of inspections at construction sites. I'm sure that's important, but MOSH does have employees that it can direct to do this. Virginia has done it, again, with no cost. It's really hard to understand how they get to the fiscal note that they have done. And I'll just close by saying thank you so much for considering this legislation to protect our workers who so desperately need it right now and are trying to keep all of us, all of our society functioning, and we owe it to them to keep them safe through mandatory and enforceable workplace protections that do not exist as of now. Thank you.
Any questions for Ms. Waterman? Seeing none. Thank you very much. Gwen Du Bois,
that's fine.
Du Bois.
Thank you, Chairman Davis, Delegate Valderrama. My name is Dr. Gwen Du Bois, I'm an internal medicine doctor with public health degree and president of Chesapeake Physicians for Social Responsibility, which supports HB 124. SARS-CoV-2 is the novel virus that causes pandemic, and it not only spreads up to 6 feet by droplets, but also, as we know, by aerosol particles, which spread further, stay airborne longer than droplets, leading to the infamous outbreaks in church choirs and in rose gardens. Aerosols are important and why we need this aerosol standard put forth in HB 124. 45% of infected people are asymptomatic when they spread the infection. Even though they're not coughing, sneezing, or showing signs that they are sick, they are infecting others. Some essential work sectors are riskier than others and are known as hotspots of infection. Essential workers are disproportionately Black and Hispanic. And if Black, Brown, Latinx, or Native American, once infected, are 4 times more likely to need hospitalization and nearly 3 times as likely to die. Other risk factors for severe disease include obesity, diabetes type 2, chronic lung disease, and kidney disease. Race and underlying conditions put essential workers once infected at higher risk of requiring hospitalization and dying. Thus, without more protections, there is an unfair risk to these workers. N95 and surgical masks protect the wearer from airborne particles, N95 better than surgical masks. Vaccines will help, but not prevent this disparity because vaccine rollout is taking, it's taking time. Not everyone is willing to take the vaccine. We don't know that the vaccine prevents shedding a virus, and the virus is constantly mutating and may mutate to a strain against which the vaccine is less effective. And there will always be novel respiratory infections in our future, as has been stated. Hence, we must develop effective, simple public health measures to protect essential workers from respiratory airborne infection. We are living through the worst pandemic of our lives. No regulations for essential workers were created by OSHA nor the CDC. None were developed by our governor, the Maryland Department of Health, nor MOSH. Guidance is not the same as regulations. We need regulations which help employers do the right thing. It helps employees who are dependent on their employers to create working environments safe from dangerous respiratory infections. That is why Chesapeake Physicians for Social Responsibility supports HB 124. And thank you.
Any questions for Dr. Du Bois? Seeing none. Thank you very much. Sarah Price.
Hi, thank you, Chairman Davis and members of the committee for having me back. Again, my name is Sarah Price, here for the Maryland Retailers Association. We do support protecting our retail employees and would always prefer statewide regulations over a patchwork of jurisdictional restrictions and regulations. But we do have concerns with the far-reaching scope of this bill, which largely align with those expressed by Delegate Wilson. The bill was clearly designed with COVID-19 in mind, as the sponsor has stated, but it does require employers to create a plan for controlling exposure to an undefined umbrella of airborne infectious diseases, which can include the common cold, flu, and chickenpox, which leads us to wonder if these types of diseases would be factored in as health risks that employers are responsible for, which then also leads us to ask about enforcement. The bill seems to presume that the general public was expected to be knowledgeable of and willing to comply with various exposure plans for every public business in the state. Retail workers, since the pandemic has begun, have been attacked and even murdered for trying to enforce mask policies that everyone in the country is aware of. In Maryland, retail businesses are required to call the police if shoppers refuse to comply with mask mandates. Would businesses be required to call the police in the future if shoppers refuse to follow company policy? It's a little bit unclear based on the language of the bill and the discussions that have already been had about the permanence of these regulations. Respectfully, we believe that that employer requirement portion of the bill would open the proverbial Pandora's box of protocols and regulations that could be difficult or burdensome on multiple levels to develop and enforce. And for that reason, we would urge an unfavorable report. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions for Ms. Price? Seeing none. Thank you very much. Joe Xavier.
Yes, thank you, Chairman Davis and committee. I just want to clarify that I am representing myself, my own company. In the previous testimony on HB 64, I was representing a trade organization. To introduce myself, I'm Joe Xavier, the CEO and senior consultant for Summit Sustainability Solutions. It's a safety consulting company specializing in construction. Also, I'm a former MOSH compliance officer, as well as a MOSH training education specialist under the Glenn Denning administration, and then went on to work in the manufacturing industry for a large bakery here in the Baltimore area. So I've signed on as a kind of more of a neutral, more informational only, not to support or to oppose. Just 5 comments to share. First, I do think that it does have to be limited to a pandemic emergency. And the second point, that I believe in a pandemic emergency, you want to utilize all of your resources. All of your resources would include Maryland OSHA. For a situation like this, I think Maryland OSHA would be the appropriate regulatory agency to engage, at least for the workplace portion of this. Third, we do in fact need clear guidelines and standards. What they are, we can go back and forth and debate all day long, but we do need clear guidelines and standards that can build confidence, both in the employee and with the employer. The other benefit would be that it would limit liability for the employer, because the employer is following standards that were promulgated by a regulatory agency. Point number 4, I do believe that it should remain an emergency temporary standard, regardless of what form it takes, that it should be temporary in nature. It should be for emergencies only. And if federal OSHA comes out with their own version or standard, I think that we should be quick to adopt that and let this one sunset. And lastly, 5th point, to save the time to save money and to save those important resources, I would suggest that we would take a look at the standards that were passed by Virginia OSHA. It was mentioned by a couple of other witnesses as well. While it's not perfect, it is lacking a few things, a few elements on it, but I think it would be a great baseline to start from, as opposed to starting from zero. So those are the 5 points that I wanted to make in my testimony. Thank you.
Any questions for Mr. Xavier?
I have a quick one, Mr. Chair.
Delegate Howard.
What isn't perfect about the Virginia legislation? What would be different?
So in the Virginia legislation, the one that they just passed, it became permanent and effective yesterday. Actually, they passed it earlier, but it became effective yesterday. There's some challenge to the fact that they're requiring N95s inside of vehicles with multiple people. So the challenge is an implementation challenge. I agree with the science behind requiring an N95 respirator, if a mask, a dust mask type respirator. But during a pandemic, you're usually in short supply. So we're not always going to have access to an N95 dust mask filtering face piece. I'd rather have that with the emergency services, with the nurse that had testified earlier. I'd rather have them have those devices.
I agree 100%.
So that's one of the challenges. It's an implementation challenge. You're not always going to have those N95s. The second thing is they had a temporary standard that came out in July or became effective in July. And in that standard, they actually allowed you 2 mechanisms to allow an employee to come back to work. The first mechanism was based on time. So it's the 14-day, the 10-day rule, depending on the circumstances, either 72 hours or 24 hours of no symptoms before you can come back to work after those 10 or 14 days, depending on what the circumstances were. But they also allowed a second mechanism, and that was with testing. So if you could get a quick rapid test, then that could save perhaps 4 or 5 days of those 10 days that you had to wait, and you can come back to work more quickly. So I think under some circumstances, I would like to see the availability of the rapid test as a mechanism to get employees back to work, especially in situations where they're in short supply, right? I mean, we have, during a pandemic, you would have short supply of medical healthcare workers. So you want to get them back to work as quickly as possible. The other one was, there was something to do with face shields, but I didn't see too much of an issue with that. The other issue that some people took to it was they essentially banned gaiters. There's ones that people like to put up, and they required that it would have to be at least 2 layers, which I agree with that. I feel like the synthetic gaiters that are very popular and very sleek, very tight fitting, I would prefer to see at least a double layered system, as opposed to just that single gaiter that is made of a synthetic fiber.
Okay, thank you.
Anyone else? If not, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Concludes the witness list for oral testimony for House Bill 124. I'd now like to go to House Bill 350 if Delegate Adams is with us.
Right here, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Chairman, Vice Chair, members of the committee, happy to present House Bill 350. We're going to, in this bill, attempt to make a very minor modification to the bill. Of course, I was reading some of the opposition testimony that was awfully broad, and of course had phrases like capricious demands and mercurial management. I had to go to the thesaurus for mercurial, but the point is that this is such a narrowly drafted bill that if we can't pass a bill like this for the business community in the environment that we live in today with the pandemic, then we might not be able to pass any pro-business bills at this time. So let me just describe what the bill does. I want to stay on the bill, not on the unfavorable testimony that goes way off base here. Stay on the bill. The bill, or the law as it currently exists, when you work from day one. So if I hired Chairman Davis from day 1 to day 105, I can refuse to give Chairman Davis a day off under the Sick and Safe Leave Act. from day 106 to 120, the chairman could give me a verification as to why you need the time off. And then by mutual agreement, we would have established at the date of employment, I could give the chairman the day off. And then after day 120, that's when the bill becomes fully effective and all the verification requirements are established, the obligations as me as an employer to grant, for example, shift work and et cetera. So this bill doesn't deal with day 1 to 105, and it doesn't deal with day 120 and on. It deals with this very narrow time frame between day 106 and 120. And all we're asking is that, and I'll tell you why we're asking after I explain it, but what we're saying is between that day 106 and 120, we want to change the verification requirement. We want to say, if you are at the date of employment, and we want to establish up front that you have to work during those days, this 13-day window, and then give me verification before you take the time off, that me as an employer can require that. We're talking about a 13-day window. Now, Mr. Chairman, you may remember why this nuance exists, but in essence, this is what we call the seasonal exemption. So when this bill was negotiated, for whatever reason, I believe a senator in the prior term looked at a calendar and said, okay, from Memorial Day to Labor Day added up to 106 days. Well, the problem is in Ocean City, and this bill, it does more than just give a seasonal exemption, but I'm telling you why the 100-day exists. If you work in Ocean City or you work in seasonal employment in Garrett County, you come to work before Memorial Day, you get trained up, and then you may have to work a week or so after Labor Day. So we need this bill to allow for the full seasonal exemption of 120 days. We need the verification requirement to be such that when somebody ends their summer employment, their seasonal employment, when a college student who's working for the summer goes to work, that they don't take the last 2 or 3 days off and get paid to do it. That's what this bill does. Now, there's another way around it. We could certainly go back and say, well, why don't we just say, instead of having it go from day 1 to day 106, why don't we just go from day 1 to 120? And I would say that's a much easier fix, much easier to explain. But this bill is not a mean-spirited bill. This bill is not taking broad rights away from workers. This is not Delegate Adams taking the chairman's work product and the committee's work product, throwing it up in a ball and tossing it out into the Atlantic Ocean. I'm asking for such a narrow change and modification to the bill to close a loophole. And in closing, this doesn't only just help seasonal workers in Ocean City. I'm telling you, the restaurants and the hospitality industry is hurting right now. We all know that. But it also has relevance in the construction trade. Think about retail as retailers get lined up to do work in the fall and the winter season. And in effect, by allowing this bill to move forward, you might find that employers are willing to hire and keep on the payroll seasonal workers for 120 days, not just the 106 days. And I really think this bill makes a lot of sense. If we just take a step back and understand that the bill's not exactly what the unfavorable testimony is all about, I would ask for the committee's favorable report. And thank you, Mr. Chairman, for me using that example.
Righty. Any questions for Delegate Adams? Seeing none. Delegate Chi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Delegate Adams, I'm curious, can you explain exactly what problem your bill is trying to solve? I guess I'm not quite clear after hearing your explanation of different dates and different periods. What is the current problem that you're trying to address with this bill?
So when an employer is hiring someone for a short time frame, seasonal work, for example, folks are working for a defined time frame, and they're earning during that day 1 to day 106, they're earning sick and safe leave. And what we're trying to do is allow the employer a little bit more control over whether someone at the end of the summer season, for example, could take 2 or 3 days off at the employer's expense. And that's not the reason why the bill exists. The bill's for sick and safe leave to help citizens who need the bill. It's not to give a fringe benefit to workers in that regard. And let me just add, the bill doesn't stop an employer and an employee from having a legitimate reason why they need to leave. The verification part is a legitimate policy prerogative that exists in the bill anyhow. All right, so there is some issues with shift work and how many consecutive shifts somebody can take it without verification. But at some point, anybody who's taking sick leave ultimately does have to provide verification, right? So we're really not changing the policy position. All we're saying is under this very narrow 13-day, I'm just talking, this bill only deals with this 13-day window, 106 to 120, not 1 to 106, not 120 to 10 years from now, just this window. And if it wasn't needed, I wouldn't bring it. I'm reluctant to bring any bill that changes what is a very important policy bill for the General Assembly. So the fact that I'm bringing it helps demonstrate that there's an authentic need for this fix. And I believe it's an achievable ask. That's why I'm here.
Delegate Watson?
Yes, just to clarify on Delegate Lilly. So what you're doing is you're making the seasonal exemption go from, instead of being 106 days, 120 days. Is that right?
That's correct. I believe the 106 was whenever this bill passed. I believe one of the elected officials went on a calendar and said, okay, Memorial Day is this day. And then they counted how many days does it take to get to Labor Day. That number ended up being 106. What we're saying, it should be 120.
You're saying that you're staying within the original intent of the bill.
I'm saying that if you can rationalize day 1 to 105, not allowing leave without a really good reason, all I'm saying is we are in essence saying, yes, you can take a leave between 106 and 120. And the bill describes how I'm asking that to be done, that there be a verification as to why that person's taking the leave, not merely because they want to go hang out on the beach for a couple of days to be
Gotcha.
I'm not sure everybody that leaves during that 106 to 120 is going on a 2-day vacation in Ocean City, which is why the verification is important. We're just saying verify why you're leaving.
Thank you.
Delegate Chi, did you have an additional question or you just didn't take your hand down? Okay. All right. Are there any further questions of Delegate Adams? If not, let me go to Champ McCullough. You there, Champ? All right. What about Melvin Thompson?
Yes, I'm here. Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I'm Melvin Thompson. I represent the Restaurant Association of Maryland, and we do support this legislation. And I remember when the paid sick leave legislation was debated, many lawmakers, including many on this committee, said if we identify problems in the future that we need to fix, please let us know what those problems are and we can consider fixing those. And so this is one such problem. Right now, under the current law, an employee who is a seasonal worker has to mutually agree with the employer upon time of hire that if they are to use any of the accrued sick leave days that they've earned during their employment between 107 and 120 days inclusive, then they would have to provide the employer with a verification that the leave was used appropriately. The problem is that without such mutual agreement, those employees under current law can take up to 2 consecutive shifts off without providing any verification at all, because they never agreed to such as the law requires upon the time of hire. All this legislation does is allows the employer by written notification at the time of hire to say, this is our policy. If you want to take any days off between 107 and 120, you must provide written verification of the reason why. so that there is some sort of verification that the leave has been used appropriately. The reason why this is important is because under current law, when a seasonal employee gets to the end of the season, they can take a couple days off without providing any verification to the employer. So that's all this bill intends to do, and fix a problem that's not only happening in Ocean City, but also around other parts of the state with employers who have seasonal employees. And so we're just trying to fix that problem to make sure that such leave is used appropriately and you don't have a lot of employees taking days off at the end of the season. I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Let me start first, Melvin, because I was one of the ones who said at that time, if there were issues, bring them to the committee. But what I also said at that, and I'm not, this isn't to prejudice the bill one way or the other, but one thing I know I added in that, and some, maybe not at the hearing, but in my conversations with some of the folks was, bring some empirical data as well. Because at the time it felt like these were things we were afraid of that could happen, that might happen, that possibly could happen, but they hadn't happened as of yet. There wasn't this mass, folks taking off. We had just passed the bill. So I guess what I'm asking for example, for your guys, I mean, have they, in the couple years that it's been out there, have they actually experienced this the end of the year and folks are taking off or whatever, or are we still on the conceptual that this could happen stage?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And we do have employers who have told us anecdotally that they've had these situations occur. Last year, I believe we heard from the Ocean City Chamber of Commerce some survey responses that they received from their members regarding the incidence of this occurring. We have not done a survey of our members, but we do hear questions about it. I get questions all the time about whether they can require verification if only 1 or 2 shifts are missed. And I remind our employers that no, the law says that it has to be more than 2 consecutive shifts. And then they bring up the example of seasonal employees and what happens at the end of the season. So we know that it's happening, but I don't have empirical data from any surveys or incidents of it happening to bring to you.
If you can, whatever that you have or could get your hands on, because see, look, let me just be blunt. For me, and I'm not even thinking of this, but I'm thinking of all of them. If we were to go forward with it, I'd have to defend it, or I'd make CT do it. But the point is, the committee would have to defend it, and I would need to have something to say this is what's going on. I'd have to be able to point to something, you see what I'm saying? I need a little something more than, and I don't want to characterize it. That's why I'm struggling with the words here, because I don't want to say anything prejudicial, but I'm just saying, if I go, if someone were to contest, the committee's passing of the bill, if they were to say, well, how widespread is the problem? Or what data do you have, or anything like that? I won't have anything close to being able to justify making a change. And then it just sort of goes back to where we were a couple of years ago, that it was more about, we don't like this, or we don't think this is good, versus a problem has been created. So I'm not asking for anything big or whatever, but just for the record, if there's anything that you guys got to sort of back up your position, I think that would be helpful to the members.
I understand completely, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much. And I'll see what information we can provide on that.
Thank you, sir. Anyone else? If not.
Mr. Chairman, real briefly, I just wanted to add that this is going to have a Senate cross file that's bipartisan. My understanding is Senator Carrozza and Senator Hester they have a small business work group on the Senate side that has prioritized this bill. So I just wanted to add that for testimony.
Yes, sir. Tyra Robinson.
Yes, hello. Greetings, Chairman Davis, Vice Chair Dumais, and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Tyra Robinson, and I'm an attorney at the Public Justice Center, and I work in the Workplace Justice Project. The PJC is an anti-poverty civil legal services organization working to advance social justice, economic, and racial equity. The Workplace Justice Project works to expand and enforce the right of low-wage workers to receive an honest day's pay for an honest day's work through litigation and policy advocacy. The PJC opposes HB 350 and requests an unfavorable report. These are the reasons why. First, HB 350 undermines the purpose of the Healthy Working Families Act. The nature of sickness and domestic violence, which are the reasons that sick leave under this act can be taken, is unpredictable. The Healthy Working Families Act currently recognizes this balance by delineating when an employer can require verification for sick leave and when they must inform an employee of this. HB 350 will chill legitimate use of sick leave due to employee confusion about when an employer can rightfully deny their leave, and therefore undermine the purpose of the Healthy Working Families Act in a worker being able to access their earned sick and safe leave when they need to. Second, HB 350 is untimely. According to a report by FSG and Policy Link at the beginning of last year, recent studies have shown that people of color, particularly Latinx employees, have less access to and utilization of paid sick leave benefits. Reducing understanding of and access to a necessary workplace protection by changing the notice requirement, which ensures that workers understand how this right works, is untimely and will not help Maryland flatten the curve. Third, HB 350 is unnecessary. Employees frequently may not have verification at the very moment that they need to take sick or safe leave. The Healthy Working Families Act currently recognizes this point as well and only permits leave denial when an employee fails to provide verification for past leave and then subsequently seeks to take leave for that same reason that they tried earlier. The Healthy Working Families Act recognizes the nature and unpredictability of needing to take sick or safe leave and the employer's need to verify that leave was appropriately used. This balance was met, and the amendments proposed by this bill are unnecessary because the act already safeguards against inappropriate use of sick and safe leave. For these reasons, I urge the committee to give an unfavorable report on HB 350 so that Marylanders who have rightfully earned sick and safe leave under the Healthy Working Families Act can remain eligible for and able to utilize this leave during the ongoing public health emergency. Although I don't believe JODF is in attendance at this hearing, they do support us in the opposition of this bill. Thank you.
Any questions? I don't see any, so thank you very much. Corey Johnson. Is Corey Johnson with us? Going once. All right. Well, that concludes the witness list for those signed up orally to testify on House Bill 350. That concludes the bill hearings for today. I'd like to thank all of our witnesses and the members for a great discussion. We got one more day of bill hearings tomorrow. I got 4 or 5 of them, it seems, but from what I understand, I think they may total about 8 witnesses. So I don't expect a long day, but we'll have some announcements. And just for planning purposes, guys, we will be voting Monday. I'll give you more details later. The witness list, we'll have that ready by tomorrow. But with that, you all have a great evening. Again, thank you for your good work, a good day, and see you tomorrow.